Chapter 1, Unit 1, Claims, Reasoning, and Evidence. 1.1 Understand Claims. What is a claim, really? Let's start with the most fundamental question in all of AP English language and composition. What exactly is a claim? You might think you already know. And honestly, you have good instincts, but the College Board uses this term with real precision, and understanding that precision is the difference between a 3 and a 5. A claim is an arguable assertion, a statement that takes a position and that a reasonable person could either agree with or dispute. That last part is crucial. If I say the sky is blue, that's not a claim in the rhetorical sense, it's just a fact. But if I say social media is eroding meaningful human connection, now we're somewhere interesting. Someone could push back on that. Someone could agree, disagree, or qualify it. That tension, that argumentative energy, is what makes something a claim. Think of it this way. Imagine you're at a dinner table and someone says something that makes your uncle put down his fork and say, "Now wait a minute." That moment, that fork down moment, is a claim doing its job. The College Board's claim vocabulary, here's where you need to be technically precise, because the AP exam will ask you to identify and distinguish between different types of claims, and using the wrong term in a free response question costs you scoring points. The College Board identifies several key claim types. The first is a claim of fact, which asserts that something is or was true, that it exists, existed, or will exist. Incarceration rates have increased since 1980 as a claim of fact. It's still arguable in the rhetorical sense because evidence can be contested, but it points toward verifiable reality. Don't confuse this with an obvious, uncontested fact. A claim of fact stakes out ground that could theoretically be disputed. Then there's a claim of value, which argues that something is good, bad, right, wrong, beautiful, or worthwhile. The American criminal justice system is fundamentally unjust, is a claim of value. You'll notice it involves a judgment. Value claims are everywhere in the texts you'll analyze on the exam, and they're often layered underneath what looks like a factual argument. Next is a claim of policy, which argues that something should be done, that action should be taken, changed, or stopped. Congress should pass comprehensive immigration reform is a classic claim of policy. The signal word is almost always should or must or ought. Policy claims are especially common in the synthesis and argument essays. Finally, and this one trips students up, there's a claim of causation asserting that one thing caused another. Poverty causes crime is a causal claim. The exam will test whether you can distinguish correlation from causation in an author's argument and whether an author has provided sufficient warrant for a causal connection. Central claims versus supporting claims. One of the most important distinctions the AP exam will test you on is the difference between a central claim, sometimes called a thesis, and supporting claims. Think of a well-built argument like a building. The central claim is the architectural blueprint, the single, overarching position the entire piece is designed to support. Every supporting claim is a load-bearing wall helping hold that structure up. When you're reading a passage on the exam, your job is to identify the central claim first, then map how the supporting claims work in service of it. A common mistake is to identify a supporting claim as the central claim. How do you avoid that trap? Ask yourself, is this assertion the goal of the whole piece, or is it a step along the way? The central claim is where the author is trying to take you. Supporting claims are how they get you there. Here's a vivid way to think about it. If the central claim is the destination on a road trip, the supporting claims are the highways and routes the author takes to get there. They matter enormously. The wrong route fails to reach the destination, but they aren't the destination itself. Explicit versus implicit claims. The AP exam loves to test whether you can identify implicit, sometimes called unstated or implied claims, and this is where careful reading separates high scorers from everyone else. An explicit claim is stated directly in the text. You can point to the sentence. An implicit claim is one the author builds toward through evidence, examples, and tone without ever stating outright. Imagine an author spends 3 paragraphs describing the physical deterioration of a neighborhood after a factory closed, the unemployment statistics, and interviews with displaced workers, all without ever writing the sentence, "Corporate decisions harm communities." That sentiment is the implicit central claim. You're expected to infer it from the accumulation of evidence and rhetorical choices. On the multiple-choice questions, you'll often see answer choices that are paraphrases or inferences about the author's position. The trap is choosing an answer that goes too far, an inference the text doesn't actually support, versus an answer that captures exactly what the evidence implies. Stay tethered to the text. Your interpretation must be defensible with specific textual evidence. Why this matters for the FRQ scoring rubric. On the argument FRQ, the College Board Scoring Rubric awards a point specifically for a thesis that presents a defensible claim, not a summary, not a statement of fact, but an arguable, specific position. Students lose this point constantly by writing something like, "This essay will discuss the pros and cons of social media." That's not a claim, that's a table of contents. A scoreable thesis makes an actual argumentative assertion that a reasonable person could dispute. For the rhetorical analysis FRQ, you need to identify the author's central claim as part of understanding the rhetorical situation. If you misread the central claim, your entire analysis of how the rhetoric works will be off-center. The claim is your compass. Connections to the rest of the course. Understanding claims is foundational to every single unit in this course. In Unit 2, you'll examine how evidence supports or fails to support claims, but you have to know what the claim is before you can evaluate the evidence. In Unit 3, you'll analyze reasoning, which is the logical bridge between claim and evidence. In Units 4 through 6, you'll look at how style, syntax, and rhetorical appeals shape how claims are delivered and received. Claims are the skeleton. Everything else is how the body moves. A quick mental checklist whenever you encounter an argument. What is the central claim? Is it explicit or implicit? What type of claim is it? Fact, value, policy, or causation? And how do the supporting claims connect back to it? With that solid foundation in what claims are and how to identify them, you're ready to move into the exciting territory of how authors actually build those claims into convincing arguments, which brings us directly to reasoning and evidence in the sections ahead. 1.2 Understand defensible claims. What makes a claim defensible? Let's start with a question. Imagine you're sitting across from a very smart, very skeptical friend. Let's call her your ideal reader, and you say to her, "The sky is blue." She nods. No argument there. Now you say, "Social media is ruining society." She raises an eyebrow. "Is it though?" she asks. "What do you mean by ruining? What counts as society? Can you actually prove that?" And just like that, you've stumbled into the heart of what College Board means when they ask you to write a defensible claim. A defensible claim, in AP language terms, is a statement that takes a clear, specific position on an issue, one that a reasonable person could agree with or disagree with, and that can be supported with evidence and reasoning. That last part is crucial. If your claim is so obviously true that no one would push back, it's not defensible. It's just a fact. And if your claim is so vague or sweeping that no evidence could ever really nail it down, it collapses under its own weight. The sweet spot is a claim that has teeth. It says something meaningful, it takes a side, and it invites the kind of conversation where you have to actually prove your point. The fact versus claim distinction, and why it matters on the exam. Here's a distinction College Board will test you on repeatedly, so lock it in now. A fact is verifiable and non-controversial. The United States declared independence in 1776. A claim is an arguable assertion that requires support. The American Revolution was more about economic self-interest than political ideology. See the difference? The second statement is defensible precisely because thoughtful people disagree about it. Good historians have spilled considerable ink on both sides of that debate, which means there's actually something to argue. This is one of the most common traps on the multiple-choice section. You'll be given a passage and asked to identify the author's central claim, and one of the wrong answers will be a restatement of a fact that appeared in the text. Students who aren't paying attention will circle it because it sounds important. It might even be the most dramatic sentence in the paragraph, but a fact doesn't need to be argued for. It just needs to be looked up. A claim, on the other hand, is what the author is trying to convince you of using those facts. The anatomy of a strong defensible claim. Think of a well-constructed claim like a good GPS direction. A bad GPS says go toward the city. A good GPS says turn left on Maple Street in 0.3 miles. Precision matters. In the same way, a weak claim says something like technology has changed society. That's technically arguable, but it's so broad it's almost meaningless. Of course technology has changed society. A stronger claim says the widespread adoption of smartphones has made adolescents more socially anxious by replacing face-to-face communication with curated performance-based interaction. Now that GPS has an address. College Board evaluates claims along two axes you should always keep in mind: specificity and complexity. Specificity means your claim names the what, the who, and often the how or why. Complexity means your claim acknowledges that the issue isn't simple. It might concede a counterargument, identify a tension, or recognize that cause and effect relationships are layered. A sophisticated claim doesn't just say X is true, it says X is true because of Y, or in spite of Z, or when condition A is met, but not when condition B applies. That layering is what separates a Score 3 essay from a Score 5 essay on the FRQ rubric. The FRQ scoring connection. This is where points are won and lost on the free response section. Particularly the argument essay College Board scoring rubric awards a full point in the thesis row if your thesis presents a defensible claim that establishes a line of reasoning. Notice what that phrase means, a line of reasoning. Your claim can't just stake a position. It needs to gesture toward the logic that will unfold in your essay. It's the difference between saying, I think electric cars are better than gas cars, and saying electric cars represent a more sustainable long-term transportation solution because they reduce dependency on finite fossil fuels and can be powered by an increasingly renewable energy grid. The second version tells your reader not just what you believe, but why, and that why becomes the skeleton of your entire argument. A common FRQ trap is writing what scorers call a thesis-adjacent statement, something that restates the prompt, expresses a general sentiment, or announces your topic without taking a position. In this essay, I will discuss the pros and cons of electric vehicles earns 0 points in the thesis row. It's not defensible because it doesn't actually claim anything. You haven't told your reader which side of the argument you're on. Distinguishing defensible claims from mere opinions. There's one more distinction worth drawing carefully, because students muddy this constantly. A defensible claim is not the same as a personal opinion. I love hiking is an opinion. It reflects your taste, and there's nothing to argue because no one can tell you you're wrong about your own feelings. A defensible claim, by contrast, transcends personal preference and speaks to something beyond the self. Exposure to natural environments has measurable psychological benefits that modern urban design consistently undervalues. That claim is grounded in evidence applicable beyond the author's personal experience and challengeable by someone with a different interpretation of the same data. It lives in the world of public discourse, not private feeling. Connections to the rest of the course. Understanding defensible claims is foundational to everything else you'll do in AP Language in Unit 2. When you analyze rhetorical situations, you'll be asking, what claim is this speaker making, and why does the context make that claim persuasive or not? In Unit 3, when you study line of reasoning, you're essentially mapping how an author builds from their claim outward through evidence and warrants. And in Unit 4, when you work with sources in the synthesis essay, your job is to construct your own defensible claim and use multiple sources as evidence to support it, not simply summarize what others have said. The claim is always the engine. Everything else is the fuel. Think of it this way. Every argument is a house. The defensible claim is the foundation. Without a solid, specific, arguable foundation, the walls lean, the roof sags, and the whole structure falls apart under the weight of scrutiny. Get the claim right, and everything else has somewhere to stand. In the next section, we'll explore how that foundation gets built upward by looking at how evidence and reasoning work together to support your claim and give your argument real structural integrity. 1.3 Understand evidence. What evidence actually does. Let's start with a simple truth. A claim without evidence is just an opinion wearing a suit. You can walk into any argument, any courtroom, any boardroom, and say whatever you want. But the moment someone asks, "How do you know that?" you'd better have an answer. That answer is evidence. And in AP language, your ability to identify, evaluate, and analyze evidence is one of the most tested skills on the entire exam. So let's get it exactly right. Evidence in the College Board's framework is the specific information a writer uses to support a claim. Think of it like the legs of a table. Your claim is the tabletop, the thing you want people to look at, but without legs underneath it, the whole thing collapses. Evidence holds the argument up. Now here's the key distinction the AP exam loves to test. Evidence is not the same as reasoning. Evidence is the what, the facts, data, examples, or testimony a writer presents. Reasoning is the so what, the logical explanation of how that evidence actually connects to and supports the claim. Students mix these two up constantly, and it costs them dearly on FRQ scoring rubrics. More on that in a moment. The types of evidence you must recognize. The College Board expects you to recognize and analyze several distinct types of evidence, and they show up on both the multiple choice section and the free response questions. The first type is data and statistics, numbers, percentages, survey results, experimental findings. When a writer tells you that a 2019 study found that 73% of teenagers report feeling anxious about social media, that's quantitative evidence. It feels authoritative because it's precise. But here's your trap alarm. Precision doesn't equal accuracy. On the MCQ, you'll be asked to evaluate whether the data actually supports the claim being made, or whether the writer is stretching it. A statistic about teenagers in one country doesn't necessarily support a claim about teenagers worldwide. Watch for that mismatch. The second type is anecdotal evidence, specific personal stories, or individual examples. A writer describing one family's struggle with medical debt to support a claim about the healthcare crisis is using an anecdote. Anecdotes are powerful rhetorically because they're human and emotionally resonant, but they're logically limited. The AP exam will ask you to recognize when a writer leans too heavily on a single story to support a sweeping generalization. That's a form of the hasty generalization fallacy, and being able to name it and explain it is a scoring point. Third is expert testimony, quotations or conclusions from credentialed authorities in a relevant field. A climate scientist's published conclusion about rising sea temperatures is expert testimony. A celebrity's opinion about climate change is not, even if they say the same words. The exam tests whether you can assess the relevance of the expertise, not just the presence of a credential. Fourth is historical or literary examples, references to established events, texts, or cases that serve as evidence by analogy or precedent. When a writer invokes the failure of prohibition to argue against drug criminalization policies, they're using a historical example. Your job on the exam is to evaluate how well the analogy holds. Evidence versus reasoning, the distinction that wins points. Here is where so many students lose FRQ points, so listen carefully. On the argument essay and the synthesis essay, the College Board scoring rubric specifically evaluates whether you explain the connection between your evidence and your claim. Simply dropping a quote or statistic into your paragraph is not enough. You have to do the work of reasoning, spelling out why that evidence supports your point. Think of it this way. Evidence is the ingredient, reasoning is the recipe. You can hand someone a raw egg, some flour, and sugar, but unless you explain how to combine them, nobody gets a cake. When you're writing your FRQ responses, every piece of evidence needs a because, a this shows, or a which demonstrates. Readers scoring your essay are explicitly trained to look for that logical bridge. Evaluating the quality and relevance of evidence, the AP exam doesn't just ask you to identify evidence, it asks you to evaluate it. This is a higher-order skill, and it's where multiple-choice questions get genuinely tricky. Ask yourself 3 questions about any piece of evidence. First, is it relevant? Does it actually address the claim being made, or is it tangentially related? Second, is it sufficient? Does the amount and scope of evidence justify the size of the claim? A single study doesn't prove a universal truth. Third, is it credible? What is the source? And do they have the expertise and objectivity to be trusted? The classic MCQ trap here is presenting you with a passage where the evidence seems to support the claim because it's in the same general topic area, but actually doesn't directly address it. A writer claiming that social media causes depression, then citing data showing that depressed teenagers use social media more, has made a correlation causation error. The data is real. The evidence is relevant to the topic, but it doesn't actually support the causal claim. That's the trap. Slow down, read precisely, and match the claim to the evidence like a key to a lock. Edge cases and common exam traps. 2 edge cases show up again and again. The first is the red herring, evidence that distracts you with something emotionally compelling but logically irrelevant. The second is cherry-picking, where a writer presents only the evidence that supports their side while ignoring contradictory data. You may be asked to identify what type of evidence is absent from a passage, which is a sophisticated question testing whether you understand what a complete, balanced argument looks like. Also know this, on the synthesis essay, you'll be working with multiple sources, and the College Board specifically rewards students who evaluate source credibility and acknowledge conflicting evidence rather than ignoring it. Using evidence in a sophisticated way means showing you understand its limitations, not just its strengths. Connections to the rest of the course. Evidence doesn't live in isolation in Unit 2. You'll analyze how writers select and frame evidence as part of their rhetorical choices. The decision to use a heartbreaking anecdote rather than dry statistics is itself a rhetorical move that reflects the writer's awareness of their audience. In Unit 4, you'll look at how different sources present the same event with different evidence, which is directly tied to the concept of perspective and bias. And throughout every free response task, your ability to use evidence effectively is the single most reliable separator between a score of 3 and a score of 5. Understanding evidence is really understanding how knowledge gets built and defended, and that sets you up perfectly to explore the next layer of argument, how writers use rhetorical appeals to make their evidence land with maximum force. 1.4 Understand reasoning. What is reasoning really? Let's start with a simple question. What's the difference between someone telling you something and someone convincing you of something? That gap, that space between assertion and persuasion, is exactly where reasoning lives. Reasoning is the logical framework a writer uses to connect their evidence to their claim. Think of it this way. If your claim is the destination and your evidence is the car, then reasoning is the road. Without it, you've got a vehicle with nowhere to go. College Board wants you to understand reasoning not just as a vocabulary word, but as a living, functional element in any argument you read or write. On the AP Lang exam, you'll be asked to identify reasoning in multiple-choice passages, analyze how it works in the free response questions, and deploy it yourself in your own argumentative writing. So let's break it down completely. The 3 pillars, claim, evidence, reasoning. You've probably already encountered the idea of claims and evidence, but here's where students most often stumble. They treat reasoning like an afterthought, like decorative glue between the real parts of an argument. Wrong. Reasoning is the engine. It's the logical explanation of why your evidence supports your claim. Picture a courtroom. A prosecutor says, "My client is innocent." That's the claim. Then she holds up a receipt showing the defendant was across town at 9 p.m. That's evidence. But then she has to explain to the jury, the murder occurred at 9 p.m. downtown, and it is physically impossible to be in 2 places at once. Therefore, this receipt proves the defendant could not have committed the crime. That explanation, that logical bridge, is the reasoning. Without it, the jury might just stare at the receipt and shrug. On the AP exam, a common multiple-choice trap is to confuse evidence with reasoning. Evidence is factual, observable, quotable, data, statistics, anecdotes, expert testimony. Reasoning is the explanation of the logical relationship between that evidence and the claim. When you see an answer choice that says, "The author uses the statistic to support the argument," pause and ask yourself, is this describing the evidence, or is it describing the reasoning? A strong answer choice will articulate how the evidence functions logically, not just that evidence appears. Types of reasoning you must know. College Board distinguishes several modes of reasoning, and understanding each one is essential for both analysis and composition. Inductive reasoning moves from specific observations to a general conclusion. You notice it's rained on every Monday for 5 weeks, and you start to wonder if something is going on with Mondays. Scientists use inductive reasoning constantly, collecting individual data points and working toward a broader principle. The key thing to understand about inductive reasoning is that it builds probability, not certainty. On the exam, watch for arguments that overgeneralize from limited examples. This is a classic logical weakness that MCQ and FRQ questions will ask you to evaluate. Deductive reasoning works in the opposite direction from a general principle to a specific conclusion. It's the Sherlock Holmes model. You start with, all mammals are warm-blooded and dolphins are mammals. So you conclude dolphins are warm-blooded. Deductive reasoning, when valid and sound, produces airtight conclusions. On the exam, the distinction between valid, the logic holds structurally, and sound, the premises are actually true, is important. An argument can be logically valid, but still wrong if the premise is false. This edge case appears regularly in MCQs, testing your ability to evaluate the strength of an argument. Analogical reasoning compares two situations to argue that what's true in one case is likely true in another. Think of it as the "it worked for them, so it'll work for us" approach. Politicians use it all the time, comparing a new policy proposal to a successful historical precedent. The strength of analogical reasoning depends entirely on how similar the two situations actually are. On the exam, a common trap is an answer choice that treats a flawed analogy as strong reasoning simply because it sounds persuasive. Train yourself to ask, are these situations actually comparable in the ways that matter? Causal reasoning argues that one thing causes another. This is fertile ground for exam questions because causal reasoning is notoriously tricky. The College Board loves to test the difference between correlation and causation. Just because two things happen together doesn't mean one caused the other. If ice cream sales and drowning rates both rise in summer, ice cream is not killing anyone. The hidden variable is warm weather. When you see causal claims in a passage, your job is to evaluate whether the author has actually established a mechanism of causation or merely pointed to a coincidence. Reasoning as a rhetorical move. Here's where it gets exciting, and where the AP Lang exam goes deeper than most students expect. Reasoning isn't just about logic, it's a rhetorical choice. A skilled author chooses which type of reasoning to deploy based on their audience and purpose. A scientist writing for peers might lean heavily on inductive reasoning built from data. A politician rallying a crowd might favor emotional analogies. A lawyer writing a brief will use deductive logic to build an airtight case. When you're writing your own argumentative essay on the AP exam, particularly the argument FRQ, the scoring rubric explicitly rewards commentary that explains how and why evidence supports a claim. That commentary is your reasoning. Students who earn 3 seconds on the FRQ often drop evidence and move on, assuming the connection is obvious. Students who earn 5 seconds slow down and explain the logical bridge. The rubric calls this sophistication of thought and development of a line of reasoning, which means the connections between your ideas must be explicit, not assumed. Common pitfalls and exam traps. Watch for circular reasoning when a claim is used as its own evidence. This policy is good because it produces good outcomes. That's not reasoning. That's repetition dressed up in different clothes. It sounds logical but goes nowhere. Similarly, watch for hasty generalizations, inductive leap from too few examples, false dilemmas, presenting only two options when more exist, and strawman arguments, misrepresenting an opposing view to make it easier to refute. These logical fallacies often appear in MCQ passages and in the synthesis FRQ, where you must evaluate the quality of sources. Connections across units. Understanding reasoning is foundational to everything that follows in AP Lang. In Unit 2, when you analyze rhetorical situations, you'll examine how reasoning choices are shaped by audience and context. In Unit 4 on sources, you'll evaluate whether the reasoning connecting evidence to claims is credible and logical. In Unit 7 and 8, when you write your own arguments, you'll be constructing lines of reasoning from scratch. Reasoning is the connective tissue of the entire course. With a solid understanding of how claims, evidence, and reasoning work together, you're now ready to zoom out and examine how those elements operate within the larger structure of an argument, which is exactly where we're headed next. 1.5 Understand commentary. What commentary actually is. Let's start with an analogy. Imagine you're watching a baseball game and a player hits a home run. The play-by-play announcer says that ball is gone deep into left field, it's a home run. That's evidence, it describes what happened. But then the color commentator leans into the microphone and says, and that's exactly why the manager moved him to the cleanup spot this season. He has the patience to wait for his pitch and the power to punish mistakes. That's commentary. Commentary explains the significance of what just happened. It connects an observed moment to a larger meaning. On the AP language exam, commentary is the analytical glue that holds an argument together. College Board defines commentary as the writer's explanation of how evidence supports a claim. It answers the critical question, so what? Evidence tells your reader what happened or what exists. Commentary tells them why it matters and how it proves your point. You absolutely need to understand this distinction cold, because the AP exam, both the multiple-choice section and the free response questions, will test whether you can identify, evaluate, and produce commentary with precision. The three-part structure and where commentary lives. Think of a well-constructed argumentative paragraph like a sandwich. The claim is the top slice of bread. It tells you what the paragraph is arguing. The evidence is the filling, the quote, the data, the example, the anecdote, and commentary. Commentary is the bottom slice of bread that actually holds everything together and makes it a coherent meal. Without it, all your evidence just falls out. The structure is sometimes called the claim evidence commentary pattern, and College Board expects you to recognize and use it fluently. Here's a concrete example. Suppose a student writes, social media is harmful to teenagers. Studies show that teens who spend more than 3 hours daily on social media report higher rates of anxiety. Therefore, we must regulate social media platforms. Do you see the gap? Evidence is there, but commentary is missing entirely. The writer leaps from evidence straight to a conclusion without explaining why the correlation between screen time and anxiety means regulation is warranted. A strong version might read, this connection between extended screen time and elevated anxiety suggests that social media platforms are actively reshaping adolescent brain chemistry, creating dependencies that teenagers whose prefrontal cortices are still developing are neurologically ill-equipped to manage on their own. Regulation, then, becomes not a matter of preference but of public health. Now the evidence is earning its place in the argument. What commentary does and doesn't do. Here's where AP exam traps live, so pay close attention. Commentary is not a restatement of evidence. If a student quotes a statistic and then simply paraphrases it in different words, that is not commentary, that is repetition. The exam loves to present you with passages or student drafts and ask you to identify whether a particular sentence functions as commentary, and often one of the wrong answers will be a restatement dressed up to look analytical. Test yourself. Does the sentence introduce a new idea about the evidence, or does it just echo the evidence in fancier language? If it echoes, it's not commentary. Commentary is also not a transition sentence. Furthermore, the author uses another example to show this point is structural navigation, not analysis. Similarly, commentary is not a personal reaction. I found this very moving tells the reader about your feelings, not about how the evidence functions logically within the argument. College Board scoring rubrics are ruthless on this distinction. In the synthesis, rhetorical analysis, and argument essays, examiners are specifically looking for whether your commentary demonstrates sophistication, whether you're connecting evidence to your thesis in a way that illuminates rather than merely restates. Types of commentary and how to spot them. Strong commentary generally does one or more of three things. First, it explains how the evidence proves the claim. This is logical commentary, and it traces the reasoning from point A to point B explicitly. Second, it considers implications. It extends the argument forward, suggesting what follows if the evidence is true. Third, it acknowledges complexity. It addresses nuance, concedes limitations, or considers counter-arguments before reinforcing the claim. That third type is what College Board calls qualifications, and it's heavily rewarded at the upper scoring levels. Think of a lawyer in a courtroom. A rookie lawyer shows the jury a piece of evidence and sits down. A veteran lawyer shows the jury the evidence, explains exactly what that evidence proves, addresses what the defense will say about it, and then redirects the jury's attention back to the core argument, strengthened, not weakened, by the complexity. That veteran lawyer is writing sophisticated commentary. Common MCQ traps on multiple-choice questions. You'll frequently encounter passages where you're asked which sentence best explains the significance of a piece of evidence, or which revision would improve the commentary in a student draft. The traps to watch for: answers that expand on evidence by adding more evidence. More data isn't commentary. Answers that shift topics instead of deepening analysis, and answers that make sweeping generalizations that aren't actually supported by the specific evidence cited. The right answer will always do the specific intellectual work of bridging this evidence to this claim. Connection to other units and FRQ scoring. Understanding commentary here in Unit 1 is the foundation for virtually everything you'll do in Units 2 through 9. When you analyze a rhetorical argument in Unit 2, you're writing commentary about how rhetorical choices produce meaning. When you work with synthesis in Unit 3, commentary is how you explain the relationship between your sources. It's not enough to put two sources in conversation. You have to interpret that conversation. The Argument Essay Rubric awards a point specifically for sophistication, and the clearest path to that point runs directly through nuanced, multi-layered commentary that considers counter-arguments, acknowledges complexity, or connects the local argument to a broader context. On FRQs, a common scoring trap is writing paragraphs that are heavy on evidence and thin on commentary. Students who quote 3 sources in a single paragraph with only cursory analysis between them are presenting a list, not an argument. Examiners describe this as evidence without analysis, and it caps your score in the evidence and commentary rows of the rubric. The so what test. If you take nothing else from this section, take this habit. After every piece of evidence you introduce, stop and ask yourself, so what? Write the answer to that question out loud. That answer is your commentary. The more specific, the more logically developed, and the more connected to your overall thesis your answer is, the stronger your commentary becomes. Train yourself to hear the difference between an evidence sentence and a commentary sentence the way a musician trains their ear with repetition and deliberate attention. Now that you understand how commentary anchors evidence to claims, let's move forward to examine how effective arguments are structured at the larger level, because commentary at the sentence level is powerful only when the argument itself is built on a solid logical framework. 1.6. Qualify a claim. What does it mean to qualify? Here's a scenario for you. Imagine you're at a coffee shop with a friend and they say, "Coffee is good for you." You nod along. Then a few minutes later they add, "Well, unless you have anxiety and only if you don't load it with sugar," and really the research is mixed on long-term effects. That second part, all those unlesses and onlys and buts, that is qualification in action. Your friend didn't abandon their claim, they made it smarter. They made it defensible. That's exactly what the College Board means when it talks about qualifying a claim in AP language and composition. To qualify a claim is to acknowledge its limitations, exceptions, conditions, or complexities, to add precision and intellectual honesty to an argument rather than stating it as an absolute truth that admits no nuance whatsoever. And here's the key insight you need to carry into every exam question. Qualification is not weakness, it is sophistication. The writer who qualifies well is not backing down. They are demonstrating that they have thought harder than everyone else in the room. The language of qualification. The College Board will test your ability both to recognize qualification in a passage and to use it effectively in your own writing, particularly in the argument essay, FRQ3, and in the rhetorical analysis essay, FRQ2. So let's talk about what qualification actually looks like on the page. Qualifiers are the words and phrases that limit the scope or certainty of a claim. You know these already, even if you haven't named them. Words like often, frequently, in most cases, under certain conditions, typically, generally, and in some respects are all qualifiers. Phrases like, although this is largely true, with some notable exceptions, or this tends to hold when serve the same function. Even the conditional construction, if X then Y, is a form of qualification because it restricts when and how the claim applies. Think of qualification as the rhetorical equivalent of a good surgeon's consent form. A surgeon doesn't tell you the procedure is perfectly safe with no possible downsides. That would be dishonest, and it would also make you trust them less. Instead, they say this surgery succeeds in the vast majority of cases, though patients with certain conditions face elevated risk. That's a more honest, more credible statement, and in rhetoric, credibility is everything. Readers are more likely to accept a qualified claim because it signals that the writer has considered the full landscape of the issue. Qualification versus concession versus counterargument. Don't confuse these. This is one of the most tested distinctions on the AP exam, so let's slow down here. Qualification, concession, and counter-argument are related but distinct moves, and mixing them up will cost you points on both MCQs and FRQs. A counter-argument introduces an opposing view. It's a position that directly challenges the writer's claim. A concession is when the writer admits that the counter-argument has some merit or validity. But qualification is different from both. Qualification doesn't necessarily bring in an opposing view at all. Instead, it restricts the original claim itself. It says, my claim is true, but not in every case, not under all conditions, and not without complexity. Here's an analogy. Say your claim is exercise improves mental health. A counterargument would be, some studies suggest exercise has no measurable effect on depression. A concession would be, it's true that exercise alone is insufficient for severe clinical depression. A qualification would be, exercise improves mental health, particularly when practiced consistently and in social settings, though individual results vary significantly based on type, intensity, and underlying health conditions. You're still asserting the original claim, you've just refined it. You've drawn its borders more carefully on the MCQ section. You will encounter passages where you are asked to identify the rhetorical purpose of a sentence or paragraph. If that passage says something like, while this is generally true for urban populations, the data is far less conclusive in rural communities, the correct answer is almost certainly that the author is qualifying the claim, not conceding to a counterargument or making a new assertion. Why qualification makes arguments more persuasive. Here's the paradox that students struggle with. Saying always and never actually makes an argument weaker, not stronger. Absolute claims invite readers to search for counterexamples, and they will almost always find one. The moment a reader finds a single exception to your always, your entire argument feels shaky. But when you've already acknowledged the conditions under which your claim holds and the conditions under which it might not, you've taken away the reader's ammunition. You've said, in effect, yes, I already thought of that. My claim still stands. Aristotle would recognize this move immediately. Qualification is a form of logos, logical credibility, but it also enhances ethos, your credibility as a thinker. A writer who qualifies their claims comes across as careful, honest, and knowledgeable. They've earned your trust not by overpromising, but by demonstrating intellectual rigor. On the FRQ, how to qualify effectively. The argument essay rubric explicitly rewards sophistication of thought, and one of the most reliable pathways to that sophistication point is through effective qualification. You can qualify your thesis itself the way you should, or you can qualify within body paragraphs when you address the complexity of your evidence. A qualified thesis doesn't look like this. Social media is harmful to teenagers. That's absolute and easy to poke holes in. A qualified thesis looks like this. While social media offers genuine opportunities for connection and self-expression, it poses measurable risks to adolescent mental health when usage is unregulated and displaces face-to-face interaction. Notice what happened there. You didn't abandon the argument. You defined its scope, and in doing so, you made it far harder to attack. A common trap students fall into on the FRQ is confusing qualification with wishy-washiness. If you qualify so heavily that you never take a clear position, you'll lose points for lack of a defensible claim. The goal is a defensible claim that is also precise, not an endless string of howevers that leave the reader unsure what you actually believe. Connections to the rest of the course. Qualification doesn't live in isolation. It connects directly to Unit 1's broader focus on claims and evidence, and it reappears in Unit 3 when you analyze how writers structure arguments over the course of an entire text. In rhetorical analysis, you'll often need to explain how an author's use of qualification functions rhetorically, perhaps to build credibility, to appeal to a skeptical audience, or to narrow a sprawling issue to something manageable. In synthesis writing, FRQ1, you'll need to qualify your own claim as you navigate sources that don't all point in the same direction. The ability to qualify is, at its heart, the ability to think like a scholar, and that skill will carry you well beyond the AP exam. Next, we'll look at how writers use evidence to support and substantiate those carefully qualified claims, exploring the difference between types of evidence and how the College Board expects you to evaluate their effectiveness. 1.7 Recognizing and evaluating claims in arguments. Let's talk about something you do every single day without realizing it, evaluating claims. Every time you scroll through social media and think, wait, that doesn't sound right, or when a friend tells you something and you automatically ask, how do you know that? That's the skill we're building here. On the AP Lang exam, you need to do that same thing with precision and the right vocabulary. So let's make it stick. What is a claim, really? A claim is the central assertion an author wants you to accept as true. Think of it like the conclusion of an argument. It's the destination the author is trying to drive you to, but here's where students often trip up on the multiple choice. Not every statement in a passage is a claim. Some statements are facts, some are background context, and some are evidence. The claim is the one the author is arguing for, the position that requires reasoning and evidence to support it because it isn't self-evidently true. The College Board distinguishes between several types of claims, and knowing these precisely is essential for both the multiple choice and the free response. A claim of fact asserts that something is true or false. Social media use increases anxiety in teenagers. A claim of value makes a judgment about worth or morality. Social media is harmful to society. A claim of policy argues that something should be done. Schools should ban smartphones. On the exam, you'll often be asked to identify which type of claim an author is making, and confusing value with policy is one of the most common wrong answer traps. Here's the quick test. If the sentence contains the word should, or implies an action that ought to be taken, it's almost certainly a claim of policy. The anatomy of an argument, claims within claims. Here's where it gets layered and interesting. Arguments rarely have just one claim. They have a central claim, sometimes called the thesis, and multiple supporting claims, the subclaims or reasons. Think of it like a building. The central claim is the roof you're trying to hold up, and the supporting claims are the walls underneath it. Each supporting claim needs its own evidence and reasoning to stand, and all of them together bear the weight of the central claim. On the AP exam, a passage might have a complex, nuanced central claim buried near the middle or end of an essay, not in the first paragraph. Don't assume the thesis is always in the introduction. When evaluating central claims in your FRQ responses, you're expected to name the claim explicitly and assess how well the evidence and reasoning actually support it. This is a rubric point that many students lose. They describe what the author says, but don't evaluate whether the evidence actually connects logically to the claim. Evaluating the strength of a claim. Once you've identified a claim, your job is to evaluate it. The AP exam expects you to think like a critic here. Ask yourself, is the claim adequately supported? Is the reasoning logical? Are there assumptions baked in that the author never justifies? This connects directly to the concept of warrants, the underlying assumptions that link evidence to a claim. Imagine a lawyer who says my client couldn't have committed the crime because he was at a baseball game. The evidence is the baseball ticket stub. The claim is innocence, but the warrant, the hidden assumption, is that being at a game physically prevented the crime. If that assumption is shaky, maybe the game was nearby, maybe he left early, the whole argument weakens. In AP Lang, recognizing unstated warrants is a sophisticated skill that separates a score of 4 from a score of 5. Logical fallacies as evaluation tools. When you evaluate claims, you're also evaluating the reasoning connecting those claims to evidence. This is where logical fallacies come in, and the AP exam loves to test these, often without naming them explicitly. A question might describe an argument and ask you to identify its weakness, and the answer will describe a fallacy in plain language. The most common ones you'll encounter include hasty generalization, drawing a broad conclusion from too little evidence, false dichotomy, presenting only two options when more exist, ad hominem, attacking the person rather than the argument, and slippery slope, assuming that one event will inevitably lead to extreme consequences without justification. When you see an argument that feels off in a passage, train yourself to diagnose why it's off. That precision is what earns points. The difference between strong and weak claims? Strong claims are specific, arguable, and supportable. Weak claims are either too vague, technology affects us, too obvious to be worth arguing, exercise is good for you, or so extreme they collapse under scrutiny. Social media is destroying all human connection. On the AP exam, you may be asked to assess whether a claim is appropriately qualified, meaning whether the author uses hedging language, like in many cases, often or tends to avoid overstating. Overstatement is a red flag that weakens an argument, and recognizing it in both your reading and your own writing is a core skill for this course. Connecting to the rest of the course. This section is the foundation for nearly everything that follows in AP Lang. When you get to Unit 2 and start analyzing rhetorical situations, you'll need to understand what claim the author is advancing before you can analyze how they advance it. In Unit 3, when you examine evidence, you're always asking, does this evidence actually support the claim being made? And in Units 4 and 5, when you write your own arguments, you're constructing claims of your own, so understanding what makes a claim strong or weak directly improves your argument FRQ score. The synthesis FRQ in particular requires you to build a central claim and support it with subclaims drawn from multiple sources, which is exactly the architecture we've been mapping out here. One more trap worth flagging. Students often confuse the author's claim with the evidence they cite or the counter-argument they address. When a passage says, critics argue that X, that is not the author's claim, it's a counter-argument. The author's claim is what they assert against or despite those critics. Keeping those voices straight in your annotation is a habit that will save you from careless MCQ errors. You've now got the tools to not just read an argument, but to see inside it, to spot the claims, weigh their strength, and understand how they connect. Coming up next, we'll look at how authors use evidence to build and support those claims, and how you can evaluate whether that evidence actually does the job the author needs it to do. 1.8 Distinguishing between fact, inference, and opinion. Let's talk about something that sounds almost insultingly simple at first. The difference between a fact, an inference, and an opinion, and then watch it get gloriously complicated in exactly the ways the AP exam loves to exploit. Because here's the truth. Most students walk into this section thinking they already know it. They don't. And that overconfidence is exactly how College Board traps them. The foundation, 3 types of claims. Imagine you're sitting in a coffee shop watching a stranger across the room. You notice their coffee cup is empty, there are dark circles under their eyes, and they keep yawning. Now you can make 3 different kinds of statements about that person. First, you could say, their cup is empty. That's a fact, a statement that can be directly verified through observation or evidence, independent of personal feeling or interpretation. It's either true or false, and you don't need to know anything about the person to confirm it. Second, you might say they probably didn't sleep much last night. That's an inference, a logical conclusion drawn from observable evidence that goes beyond what you can directly see. You're reasoning from the yawns and the dark circles. Third, you might say, they really should go home and rest. That's an opinion, a personal judgment, evaluation, or belief that reflects values and preferences rather than just evidence. The AP exam uses precise College Board language here. A fact is a verifiable claim. An inference is a reasoned judgment based on evidence. An opinion is a personal or evaluative claim that reflects the writer's beliefs, values, or preferences. Burn those 3 definitions into your memory. But more importantly, understand the relationships between them, because the exam will absolutely test those relationships. Why inferences are the hardest category. Facts and opinions are relatively easy to spot once you're trained. Inferences are where students consistently lose points, both on multiple choice and free response, because a good inference feels like a fact. It's dressed in the costume of certainty. Think about how a detective works. When Sherlock Holmes says, "You've been in Afghanistan, I perceive," he's not stating a fact about Watson's past. He's inferring it from physical clues. The inference is logical. It might even be correct, but it is still a reasoned leap beyond the direct evidence. On the AP exam, you'll encounter passages where authors make claims that sound authoritative and certain, but are actually inferences, conclusions drawn from data rather than directly observed truths. Your job is to see through that authoritative voice and categorize the claim correctly. The College Board-specific language you must know here is that inferences are reasonable conclusions that are supported by but not directly stated in the evidence. That phrase, "not directly stated," is your key diagnostic test. If you have to connect dots to arrive at the claim, it's an inference. The most common MCQ traps? Here's where the exam gets genuinely sneaky. The most frequently tested trap involves mixing inference with fact. A passage will present a statistic, say, "Studies show that students who sleep 8 hours perform 20% better on standardized tests," and then a question will ask you to identify whether the author's follow-up claim, "Therefore you should sleep more," is a fact, inference, or opinion. Students who move too fast will call it a fact because it follows from factual data. But it's actually an opinion, or at least an evaluative claim, because the word "should" introduces a value judgment. Data doesn't tell you what you should do. That requires a values framework layered on top. The second major trap is the confident tone disguise. Authors often state inferences in declarative, authoritative sentences with no hedging language, no probably, no suggests, no may indicate. When an author writes, "This policy caused the economic downturn," that sounds like a fact, but causation is almost always an inference. Direct observation can establish correlation. Causation requires interpretive reasoning. If you see causal language, caused, led to, resulted in, produced, slow down and ask yourself whether the author actually observed the cause-effect relationship or inferred it from a pattern. The third trap is the loaded opinion. Sometimes opinions are disguised as neutral descriptions. If someone calls a politician reckless or a policy brilliant, those adjectives carry evaluative weight. They're opinions dressed as descriptions. The AP exam frequently offers an answer choice. Claiming such a statement is factual, knowing students might not pause on the evaluative dimension of the word choice. FRQ scoring and how to apply this. On the free response questions, especially the rhetorical analysis essay, you earn scoring points by accurately identifying and commenting on how an author uses these three types of claims strategically. College Board readers are looking for students who can articulate not just what type of claim an author is making, but why the author chose that type and what effect it has on the argument and the audience. When a lawyer opens a closing argument with incontrovertible facts before sliding into inferences about intent, they're building credibility before asking you to take a logical leap. When a scientist presents data and then offers an interpretive inference, they're modeling how evidence-based reasoning works. When an op-ed writer closes with an opinion rooted in shared values, they're appealing to the audience's ethics and emotions. Your job on the FRQ is to name these moves and explain their rhetorical function. That's what earns you the commentary points on the scoring rubric. Connections across the course. This concept is foundational infrastructure for everything that comes later in AP Lang. When you study argumentation in Unit 2 and Unit 3, you'll need to evaluate whether an author's claims are factual, inferential, or evaluative, because that determines how they must be supported and what kind of counterargument could challenge them. In Unit 4's source-based writing and the synthesis essay, you'll be asked to evaluate sources for credibility, and that evaluation depends heavily on distinguishing which claims in a source are verified facts versus the author's inferential or evaluative interpretations. In Unit 6's argument essay, you'll build your own claims, and the sophistication of your argument depends on knowing when you're asserting a fact, when you're drawing a logical inference that requires clear reasoning, and when you're making a value judgment that requires explicit acknowledgement. The final thing to internalize is this: no type of claim is inherently stronger or weaker than the others. Facts alone don't make arguments. You need inferences to connect evidence to conclusions, and you need opinions to establish what matters and why. The most powerful arguments weave all three together in a coherent, intentional structure. Your ability to see those seams in other people's arguments and to construct your own arguments with those seams in the right places is exactly what the AP exam is measuring. Coming up next, we'll look at how authors use those facts, inferences, and opinions to build the backbone of a complete argument, examining the structure of claims and the evidence that supports them. 1.9 Understanding Thesis Statements and Central Claims. Let's talk about the single most important sentence you'll write on the AP English Language exam. Not the most interesting sentence, not the cleverest, the most important. We're talking about your thesis statement, the central claim that tells your reader exactly what you're arguing and why it matters. Think of it like the GPS coordinates for your entire essay. Without it, your reader is just wandering around a city with no destination in mind. What a thesis statement actually is. Here's where most students get into trouble right away. They confuse a thesis with a topic. Saying this essay is about climate change is not a thesis, that's just pointing at something. A thesis argues something about that thing. It's the difference between saying there's a building over there, and that building's architecture reflects the anxieties of post-war America. One observes, one argues. The College Board is very precise about this distinction, and you'll see it tested constantly in the multiple-choice section. According to College Board's own rubric language, a thesis, whether in the synthesis, rhetorical analysis, or argument-free response question, must do two things. It must make a defensible claim, and it must establish a line of reasoning. That phrase, line of reasoning, is doing enormous work here, so let's unpack it. A line of reasoning means your thesis hints at how you're going to prove your claim. It signals the intellectual framework your argument will follow. A thesis that says social media is harmful to teenagers is defensible, but it has no line of reasoning. A thesis that says social media is harmful to teenagers because it systematically replaces deep relational skills with performative ones, ultimately stunting emotional development. Now, that gives your reader a roadmap. It tells them what you believe and the conceptual lens through which you're viewing the problem. The defensible claim requirement. Let's spend a moment on defensible because this is one of the most tested concepts in the MCQ section. A defensible claim is one that a reasonable person could actually disagree with. It's not a fact, it's not a universal truth, and it's not a statement so vague that nobody could argue against it. If I say war causes suffering, that's true, but it's not defensible in the academic sense. No one is lining up to argue the other side. If I say the glorification of warfare in American literature from 1880 to 1920 reveals a cultural anxiety about national masculinity, now we have something to argue about. The claim is specific, contestable, and interesting. This is one of the most common MCQ traps you'll face. You'll be shown 4 potential thesis statements and asked to identify which one is most defensible or most effectively establishes a line of reasoning. The wrong answers usually fall into predictable categories. One will be a statement of pure fact, one will be so broad it's meaningless, one will be a simple announcement of topic, and one, the correct answer, will make a specific arguable claim with built-in reasoning. Train yourself to eliminate the obvious non-arguments first. Central claims versus thesis statements. The College Board sometimes uses the term central claim rather than thesis, and it's worth understanding why. In a longer, more complex work, like the passages you'll analyze in the multiple-choice section, the author's central claim is the primary argument the entire piece is designed to support. It may not appear as a single, neatly packaged sentence at the end of paragraph 1. Instead, it emerges from the cumulative effect of evidence, structure, and rhetorical choices throughout the text. Your job as a reader is to reconstruct it. Your job as a writer is to make yours unmistakable. The practical difference on the exam is this. When you're reading, you identify central claims by asking, what is this writer ultimately trying to convince me of, and what's the core reason they're giving me? When you're writing, your thesis is your central claim explicitly stated, typically in your introduction, and it must meet that two-part test, defensible claim plus line of reasoning. Where the thesis lives and what it does on the FRQ scoring rubric, you earn 1 point, a standalone point simply for having a qualifying thesis. The College Board has been notably firm that this thesis cannot merely restate the prompt. If the prompt says, write an essay arguing for or against the use of social media by teenagers, and your thesis says, I will argue that social media has both benefits and drawbacks for teenagers, you have just restated the prompt in different words and earned yourself exactly nothing. The thesis must go beyond the prompt. It must commit to a position and begin explaining the intellectual architecture behind it. A common edge case to watch for, a thesis that appears in the conclusion rather than the introduction still earns the thesis point on the rubric, as long as it meets the qualifications. This comes up more often than you'd think in timed writing, where students sometimes find their real argument only after working through their body paragraphs. Good to know, but try not to rely on it. Connecting to the rest of the course. Understanding thesis statements isn't just a Unit 1 skill, it's the connective tissue of the entire course. In Unit 2 and Unit 3, when you're analyzing how writers structure arguments and develop claims with evidence, you're essentially studying how other writers execute their thesis. In Unit 4 and 5, when you examine style and rhetoric, you're looking at how language choices reinforce a central claim. The synthesis FRQ, the rhetorical analysis FRQ, and the argument FRQ all reward you specifically for how well your thesis functions as an organizing principle for everything that follows. Think of it this way: every body paragraph you write is a promise to your thesis. If your thesis argues that a policy failed for 3 interconnected reasons, your essay had better spend time on each of those reasons and show how they're connected. A thesis that promises complexity and delivers a list of unrelated facts is like a movie trailer that promises an action film, but delivers a nature documentary. Technically, both are movies, but someone's walking out of that theater disappointed. The practical exam takeaway. When you sit down to write any FRQ, spend 2 to 3 minutes before you write a single-body paragraph crafting your thesis. Ask yourself, is this a real argument, or am I just describing the topic? Does it tell the reader not just what I think, but why and how I'm going to prove it? If you can answer yes to both, you're ready to write. With a strong thesis in hand, your next challenge is making sure every piece of evidence you select actually earns its place in the argument. Which brings us perfectly to our next topic: how claims, evidence, and reasoning work together to build an airtight case. 120. Implicit versus explicit claims. What's the difference, really? Let's start with a scenario you've probably lived through. Imagine you're at dinner with your family and your mom says, "It's getting pretty cold in here." That's interesting, right? Because she didn't actually ask anyone to close the window, but somehow everyone understood that's exactly what she meant. Now compare that to your dad walking in and saying, "Someone close the window, please." Same situation, 2 totally different ways of communicating. Your mom made an implicit claim. Your dad made an explicit one. That's the entire heart of this section, and once you feel it in your bones the way you felt it at that dinner table, you'll be spotting these on AP passages like a pro. In AP language terms, an explicit claim is a statement that is directly and clearly stated in the text. No inference required, no reading between the lines. The author just tells you. An implicit claim, on the other hand, is an idea that is suggested, implied, or hinted at through word choice, examples, structure, or tone, but never actually written out in plain language. The College Board wants you to understand that skilled writers use both intentionally, and your job as a reader and writer is to recognize which is which and understand why an author might choose one over the other. Explicit claims. The author shows their cards. Think of an explicit claim like a neon sign. The author is holding it up and flashing it directly in your face. You'll recognize explicit claims because they can be quoted directly. They're the thesis statements. The topic sentences, I argue that moments when Patrick Henry says, "Give me liberty" or "Give me death." There is nothing ambiguous about that. He is explicitly claiming that liberty is worth dying for. No interpretation needed. You lift that sentence off the page, and you have his claim, complete and intact. On the AP exam, when a multiple-choice question asks you to identify the author's central claim or main argument, they are often testing whether you can locate the explicit claim in a passage. The trap the College Board loves to set here is offering you answer choices that sound like what the passage is about, but are actually paraphrases of implicit ideas rather than the stated claim. Always ask yourself, did the author actually write this, or am I inferring it? If you're inferring, you've crossed from explicit into implicit territory. Implicit claims, reading between the lines. Now, here's where the real analytical work happens, and honestly, where most of your FRQ points live. An implicit claim is what the author means without saying it outright. It's the message embedded in the structure of the argument, the connotation of specific word choices, or the cumulative effect of the examples chosen. Consider this. If an author spends 3 full paragraphs describing the environmental damage caused by a particular corporation, but never once writes, "This corporation is irresponsible," what has that author implicitly claimed? Exactly. The sustained pattern of evidence functions as an implicit argument. The author is making the case through accumulation rather than declaration. This is a rhetorical choice, not an accident, and the AP exam will absolutely ask you to recognize and explain it. Here's another way to think about it. Explicit claims are like the skeleton of an argument, the bones you can see and name. Implicit claims are like the posture the skeleton strikes. You can look at a figure hunched forward, arms crossed, and implicitly understand something about its defensive or guarded state, even if no label says defensive. The meaning is constructed through form, not label. Why authors choose one over the other. This is crucial for your FRQ responses, so lock this in. Authors choose explicit claims when they want clarity, authority, or directness, when they need the audience to be unmistakably clear about the position. Think op-eds, academic arguments, policy proposals. Authors choose implicit claims when they want to create a sense of discovery in the reader, avoid alienating a hostile audience, allow emotional resonance to do the persuasive work, or maintain plausible deniability. Satire, in particular, runs almost entirely on implicit claims. Jonathan Swift never explicitly said the British are treating the Irish as subhuman. He let the logic of eating babies make that claim for him. For your AP exam FRQ, when you're asked to analyze how an author builds an argument, you should be naming whether claims are implicit or explicit and connecting that choice to the rhetorical situation. That connection, choice to effect, is what earns you the top-tier scoring points on the rubric. The edge cases that trip students up. Here's where students lose points on MCQs. They confuse implied evidence with implicit claims. An author can explicitly state a claim and then support it with evidence that implies further ideas. These are layered, not the same, always ask. What is the actual argumentative position being advanced here? That's your claim, whether explicit or implicit. The evidence serves it. Another common trap, assuming that because a claim isn't stated in the introduction, it's implicit. Wrong. An explicit claim can appear anywhere in a text. It might emerge at the end of an essay after a buildup of evidence in what we call a delayed thesis. The College Board tests this constantly. Just because a claim arrives late doesn't make it implicit. It just means the author structured the argument inductively rather than deductively. Also, watch out for tone as implicit claim. If an author writes about a political figure using words like so-called leader or well-intentioned but naive, they haven't explicitly called that figure incompetent, but the implicit claim is loud and clear. On MCQs, you'll be asked what a passage implies. Those questions are testing your ability to read implicit claims encoded in diction and syntax. Connecting to the rest of the course. This distinction between implicit and explicit claims doesn't live in isolation. It's load-bearing for almost everything else you'll study. In Unit 2, when you analyze rhetorical appeals, you'll need to determine whether ethos, pathos, or logos is being explicitly invoked or implicitly activated. In Unit 3, when you study line of reasoning, You'll track how explicit claims are supported and how implicit assumptions function as unstated premises. This connects directly to the concept of qualifications and counterargument. And when you write your own argument essay in Unit 5, the College Board rewards writers who can make their thesis explicit while weaving implicit meaning through their evidence choices. That sophistication is exactly what separates a score of 4 from a score of 5. Coming up next, we're going to zoom in on something that lives right at the intersection of what you just learned: how to identify and evaluate the evidence authors use to support both their implicit and explicit claims, which means it's time to talk about what actually makes evidence relevant. 1.111 Evaluate evidence for relevance and sufficiency. What we're really asking. Imagine you're on a jury. The prosecutor stands up and says, "My client is innocent because," and I cannot stress this enough, "he really loves dogs." You'd lean over to the person next to you and whisper, "What does that have to do with anything? That instinct you just felt?" That's the beginning of evaluating evidence. You were checking for relevance. And if the prosecutor then says, "Also, here is one blurry photograph from 40 feet away," and rests their case, you'd feel something else, a nagging sense that this just isn't enough. That's sufficiency. These two concepts, relevance and sufficiency, are the twin lenses through which the AP exam wants you to examine every piece of evidence a writer puts in front of you. College Board frames this skill. Skill 5B in the curriculum as your ability to evaluate whether the evidence an author selects actually supports the claim being made and whether there is enough of it to make the argument convincing. On the exam, this shows up in multiple choice questions that ask you to assess the strength of an argument, and it is absolutely essential in the free response question where you synthesize or analyze rhetoric. Getting this wrong is one of the most reliable ways students leave points on the table, so let's make sure you've got it locked in. Relevance. Does this evidence actually connect? Relevance is about the logical relationship between the evidence and the claim it's supposed to support. Evidence is relevant when it directly addresses the claim, when it provides information that makes the claim more or less likely to be true. Think of it like a bridge. The claim is on one side of a river, and the conclusion is on the other. Relevant evidence is a plank in that bridge. Irrelevant evidence is a plank you dropped in the river. It exists, it might even be a nice plank, but it's doing nothing for you structurally. Here's a real-world example. A writer claims that social media use is harming teenagers' mental health. Evidence that shows a statistical correlation between increased screen time and rising rates of adolescent anxiety. Highly relevant, it directly addresses the relationship the claim describes. Evidence that social media companies made record profits last year? Interesting, perhaps damning in a different argument, but not directly relevant to the mental health claim. The AP exam loves to test this distinction. You'll see passages where an author piles in evidence that feels related to the topic, but doesn't actually support the specific claim being made. Your job is to notice the gap. One trap students fall into repeatedly on the multiple choice section is confusing topical relevance with logical relevance. Just because evidence is about the same general subject as the claim doesn't mean it supports the claim. A passage about climate change might include evidence about polar bear habitats. That's topically related to climate change, sure. But if the specific claim is about carbon emission policy in the United States, polar bear habitat data may not be logically relevant to that claim. Watch for this. The wrong answer choices often offer evidence that's in the same neighborhood as the claim without actually doing the argumentative work. Sufficiency. Is there enough here? Now, let's talk about sufficiency, which is a separate and in some ways trickier evaluation. Evidence is sufficient when there is enough of it and enough variety of it to justify the conclusion the writer draws. Think of building a case the way you'd build a campfire. One match isn't a fire. Even a pile of matches isn't a fire. You need the right combination of materials in enough quantity to sustain combustion. Similarly, a single statistic doesn't justify a sweeping generalization. A single personal anecdote doesn't prove a universal trend. College Board specifically wants you to recognize 3 dimensions of sufficiency. First, quantity. Is there enough evidence presented? A claim that something is a nationwide crisis probably needs more than one cited example. Second, variety. Does the evidence come from multiple types of sources and multiple angles? An argument supported only by anecdotes with no data, no expert opinion, and no historical context is weaker than one that combines all of these. Third, representativeness. Does the evidence reflect the full picture, or has the writer cherry-picked cases that happen to support their point while ignoring counterexamples? This last dimension connects directly to Unit 4's work on fallacies, particularly the fallacy of hasty generalization, where a writer draws a broad conclusion from an unrepresentative sample. A classic FRQ scoring trap is when students describe an author's evidence as good or strong without explaining why it's relevant or sufficient relative to the specific claim. Rubric scorers are looking for your ability to articulate the relationship, to say not just that the author uses statistics, but that these statistics are relevant because they directly measure the variable the claim addresses, and they're sufficient because they represent a large, diverse sample over multiple years. That precision is what earns the higher scoring range. Edge cases and common exam traps. Here's where students lose points on the multiple choice. The exam will sometimes present evidence that is both relevant and insufficient, or sufficient in quantity, but irrelevant in focus. These aren't mutually exclusive failures. You can have a mountain of evidence, 50 studies, reams of data, and if none of it directly addresses the claim, quantity doesn't save you. Conversely, one perfectly targeted, methodologically rigorous study can sometimes be sufficient for a narrow, carefully stated claim. The relationship between relevance and sufficiency isn't additive. You need both, and they serve different evaluative functions. Another trap confusing the writer's intention with the evidence's actual performance. An author might intend an anecdote to prove a universal point, but your job as a critical reader is to evaluate whether it actually does that work. Don't give the evidence credit for what it was trying to do. Evaluate what it accomplishes. Connecting to the larger course, this skill is the connective tissue running through the entire AP Lang curriculum in Unit 2. When you analyze argument structure, you're essentially asking whether the reasoning that connects evidence to claims is logically sound, which requires knowing whether the evidence was relevant and sufficient to begin with. In Unit 3, when you examine rhetorical appeals, you'll notice that evidence serves ethos, logos, and pathos in different ways, and evaluating its relevance and sufficiency tells you how effectively those appeals function. In the synthesis FRQ, every source you consider must pass through this same filter. Does this source speak to my specific argument, and do I have enough varied representative support to make my claim credibly? Think of 1.11 as your quality control checkpoint. Before any piece of evidence earns a place in your analysis or earns your trust in someone else's, it has to answer two questions. Does it connect? And is it enough? With these evaluation tools in hand, you're ready to go even deeper next. We'll look at how writers construct the reasoning that links their evidence to their claims, and how you can identify and analyze those logical relationships in any argument you encounter. 1.1 Types of evidence: anecdotal, statistical, expert testimony, historical. Let's talk about evidence, because on the AP Language exam, understanding how writers build their arguments is just as important as understanding what those arguments say. Think of evidence as the raw material a writer uses to construct a case. A carpenter can build a house out of brick, wood, steel, or glass, and the choice of material changes everything about how the structure holds up under pressure. The same is true for evidence. Every type has its own strengths, its own vulnerabilities, and its own persuasive logic. Your job, both as a reader and a writer, is to recognize exactly what's in use and why it matters. Anecdotal evidence. Start with the most human kind of evidence: the anecdote. Anecdotal evidence is a specific story or personal narrative, a single concrete example drawn from real or observed experience. When a writer opens an essay by describing a grandmother who couldn't afford her insulin, that's an anecdote. When a columnist recalls the moment he realized his neighborhood had changed, that's an anecdote. The anecdote works by making the abstract feel real. It creates what rhetoricians call pathos, emotional resonance, and it gives readers a face to attach to a problem. Here's where students trip up on the exam. Anecdotal evidence is not inherently weak. College Board doesn't want you to reflexively dismiss it as just a story. The question is always how the writer deploys it. A skilled writer uses an anecdote to humanize a larger claim and then supports it with other forms of evidence. Problems arise when a writer commits the logical fallacy of overgeneralization, treating one person's experience as proof of a universal trend. If someone argues my uncle smoked 2 packs a day and lived to 93, so smoking isn't that dangerous, they've made an anecdote do work it cannot support. On the MCQ, when a question asks you to identify a limitation of a piece of evidence, ask yourself, is this a single story being stretched to cover a much bigger claim? If yes, that's the vulnerability of anecdotal evidence you'll name. Statistical evidence. Now shift to the other end of the spectrum. Statistical evidence. This is numerical, quantitative data, percentages, survey results, rates, measurements, comparisons. Where the anecdote gives you one vivid story, statistics give you the pattern across thousands or millions of data points. A study showing that 68% of students who work more than 20 hours a week experience a drop in GPA carries a kind of authority that no single story can replicate. Statistics derive their power from logos, logical appeal, and from the implicit promise that individual bias has been filtered out through rigorous data collection. But statistics are also the most commonly manipulated form of evidence, and the AP exam loves to test whether you can see through that. Watch for several traps. First, correlation is not causation. 2 trends moving together doesn't mean one causes the other. Second, sample size matters enormously. A survey of 35 people tells you very little. Third, pay attention to how statistics are framed. Saying crime increased by 50% sounds alarming until you realize it went from 2 incidents to 3. On the FRQ, when you're asked to evaluate an author's use of statistical evidence, don't just say they used statistics to support their claim. Discuss the quality and context of the data, where it came from, whether the sample is representative, and whether the conclusion logically follows from the numbers. Expert testimony is evidence drawn from people with specialized knowledge, credentials, or experience in a relevant field. A cardiologist quoted on heart disease, a climate scientist cited in an environmental policy debate, a forensic economist testifying in a legal case. These are all examples. Expert testimony operates primarily through ethos, the appeal to credibility and authority. When a writer invokes an expert, they're essentially borrowing that person's professional credibility to lend weight to their own argument. The AP exam tests your ability to evaluate expert testimony critically rather than simply accepting it because someone has a title. A few key questions to ask: is the expert actually qualified in the relevant field? A famous physicist's opinion on nutrition policy isn't expert testimony, it's a celebrity opinion. Is the source recent enough to be applicable? Is there a potential conflict of interest, such as a researcher funded by the industry they're studying? These aren't reasons to automatically dismiss testimony, but they are factors that affect its reliability and that the AP rubric rewards you for noticing. In essays, when you cite expert opinion as evidence, you strengthen your argument significantly, but you also take on the responsibility of establishing why that expert should be trusted. Historical evidence uses events, patterns, precedents, and examples from the past to illuminate a present argument. A writer arguing against government overreach might invoke the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Someone making a case for urban planning reform might draw on the failed housing projects of the 1950s. Historical evidence does something unique. It demonstrates that a phenomenon has occurred before, which both normalizes a concern and grounds abstract claims in concrete, documented reality. The most common mistake students make with historical evidence is treating it as automatically authoritative simply because it happened. History is always interpreted. Writers select which events to foreground and how to frame their significance. When evaluating historical evidence on the exam, ask whether the analogy holds up. Are the historical circumstances genuinely comparable to the present situation? Or is the writer forcing a parallel that obscures important differences? This is sometimes called a false analogy, and it's a frequent trap in MCQ wrong answer choices. Putting it all together for the exam. Here is the synthesis you need to carry into every AP Lang task. Strong arguments rarely rely on a single type of evidence. The most effective writers layer these 4 types strategically, opening with an anecdote to create emotional investment, grounding the claim in statistics to establish scale, citing expert testimony to build credibility, and anchoring the whole argument in historical precedent to show the stakes. When you encounter an FRQ asking you to analyze an author's argument, your commentary on evidence should always address not just what kind of evidence it is, but what rhetorical work it performs, what assumptions it rests on, and where its limits lie. This topic connects directly to your work in Unit 3 on rhetorical appeals, because each evidence type maps naturally onto logos, pathos, and ethos, and to Unit 4, where you'll analyze how writers structure entire arguments across a text. Understanding evidence types is also foundational for the synthesis essay in Section 2, where you'll be asked to select from multiple sources and integrate them into your own argument. Knowing the strengths and weaknesses of each evidence type helps you choose sources wisely and qualify your claims appropriately. With a firm grasp of what evidence looks like and how it functions, you're perfectly positioned to explore the next challenge. Understanding how writers move from evidence to conclusion, and that means diving into the logic of reasoning itself. 1.3 Inductive versus Deductive Reasoning. The 2 roads to a conclusion. Imagine you're a detective. You walk into a room and notice muddy boots by the door, a wet umbrella in the corner, and a damp coat hanging on a hook. From those specific clues, you draw a general conclusion. Someone just came in from the rain. That's inductive reasoning at work. Now flip it around. You already know the rule: whenever it rains, the ground gets wet, and wet ground means muddy boots. It's raining outside right now, so you conclude with certainty those boots will be muddy. That's deductive reasoning. 2 different roads, 2 different kinds of certainty, and the AP exam wants you to know exactly which road a writer is traveling. Let's make these definitions precise. Because College Board uses specific language, you need to match on both the multiple choice and the free response sections. Inductive reasoning moves from specific observations to a general conclusion. You gather evidence, look for patterns, and then make a broader claim about the world. Deductive reasoning moves in the opposite direction, from a general principle or premise down to a specific conclusion. Think of it as top-down versus bottom-up thinking. Inductive reasoning, building up from the evidence. When a writer uses inductive reasoning, they are essentially saying, look at all these specific examples. Here's the bigger pattern they reveal. The strength of inductive reasoning depends entirely on the quality and quantity of the evidence. 1 muddy boot doesn't prove much. 100 muddy boots from 100 different visitors on 100 different rainy days. Now you're building a compelling case. The key term you need for the AP exam is that inductive conclusions are probabilistic, not certain. No matter how many specific instances you pile up, there's always a theoretical possibility that the next instance breaks the pattern. Scientists work inductively most of the time. They observe, gather data, and form hypotheses. But no scientist would say their conclusion is absolutely guaranteed just because the pattern has held so far. On the AP exam, when a passage uses phrases like, the evidence suggests, studies indicate, or based on these cases we can conclude, you're almost certainly looking at inductive reasoning. Here's where a common MCQ trap lives. Students often assume that a long list of examples automatically makes an argument strong. Not so fast. The AP exam will ask you to evaluate whether inductive reasoning commits the fallacy of hasty generalization, drawing a sweeping conclusion from too few, too narrow, or unrepresentative examples. If a writer interviews 3 people in one city and concludes that all Americans believe X, that's inductive reasoning gone wrong. The conclusion outstrips the evidence. Watch for this in passage-based questions that ask you to identify a weakness in the argument or an assumption the author is making. Deductive reasoning, arriving with the answer already in hand. Deductive reasoning starts with what logicians call a syllogism, a formal structure built on 2 premises that lead inevitably to a conclusion. The classic example you've probably seen goes like this. All humans are mortal. Socrates is a human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Notice that if both premises are true and the logical structure is valid, the conclusion cannot be false. That's the power of deductive reasoning. When it works correctly, it delivers certainty. The AP-specific vocabulary here is crucial. A deductive argument is valid if the conclusion follows logically from the premises, regardless of whether the premises are actually true. It is sound if it is both valid and the premises are actually true. This distinction trips up students constantly. An argument can be perfectly valid in its structure and still lead to a false conclusion if one of the premises is false. Here's a deliberately absurd example to make it stick. All dogs can fly. Spot is a dog. Therefore, Spot can fly. That argument is logically valid. The conclusion follows from the premises, but it is not sound because the first premise is obviously false. On the AP exam, questions about deductive reasoning often hinge on this exact distinction. You may be asked whether an author's conclusion necessarily follows from their premises, or whether the argument would fall apart if a stated assumption were challenged. Spotting the difference on the exam. One of the most reliable ways to distinguish these two reasoning types in a passage is to ask yourself which direction the argument flows. Does the writer start with a general rule or principle and apply it to a specific case? Deductive. Does the writer accumulate specific data, examples, or observations to build toward a general claim? Inductive. In practice, sophisticated arguments often use both. A writer might inductively establish that certain economic conditions tend to produce social unrest, and then deductively apply that principle to predict what will happen in a specific country. The AP exam rewards students who can identify which mode is operating in a given moment of an argument, not just which one dominates the whole piece. The free response questions, especially the rhetorical analysis and argument essays, give you direct opportunities to demonstrate this understanding. In rhetorical analysis, if you're discussing how an author builds their argument, naming the specific reasoning strategy and explaining how it functions is a high-value observation. Saying the author uses inductive reasoning, drawing on 5 case studies from different industries before asserting a universal economic principle, which lends the claim empirical credibility, while also risking the fallacy of hasty generalization, is exactly the kind of precise, nuanced commentary that earns scoring points. Vague statements, like the author uses evidence, will not. Connections to the broader course. Understanding inductive and deductive reasoning connects directly to your work throughout Unit 1 and beyond. When you evaluate claims and evidence in Unit 1, you are assessing whether the reasoning type matches the strength of the evidence, a deductive structure with a false premise, or an inductive leap with insufficient data. Both represent argumentative weaknesses. In Unit 3, when you analyze the rhetorical situation and an author's purpose, recognizing that a speaker chose deductive reasoning can tell you something important. They're appealing to shared principles they assume the audience already accepts. That's a rhetorical choice, not just a logical one. And in your own argument writing, leaning too heavily on inductive reasoning without enough evidence leaves your claim vulnerable, while a deductive argument is only as strong as the premises your audience is willing to grant you. One final trap to keep in your back pocket. Don't confuse the quality of a conclusion with the type of reasoning used to reach it. A brilliant, well-supported inductive argument is stronger than a sloppy deductive one built on shaky premises. The exam isn't testing which type of reasoning is better. It's testing whether you can identify, analyze, and evaluate how each type functions in context. Now that you've got a firm grip on how reasoning structures work at the logical level, we'll turn our attention to how writers actually deploy evidence, the specific kinds of support they choose, and why those choices shape the persuasive impact of any argument. 1.14 Logical Fallacies and Faulty Reasoning. Let's talk about something that shows up everywhere. In political speeches, in advertisements, in arguments with your cousin at Thanksgiving dinner, and absolutely all over the AP language exam. We're talking about logical fallacies, and your ability to identify and analyze them is one of the most tested skills in this entire course. So lean in, because this is where rhetoric gets really interesting. What is a logical fallacy? Exactly. Think of an argument as a bridge. The claims are the starting point, the evidence is the support structure, and the conclusion is the other side. A logical fallacy is when one of those support beams is rotten. The argument looks like it's holding up, but if you step on it, you fall straight through. College Board defines faulty reasoning as a flaw in the logical structure of an argument that undermines the validity of its conclusion. Notice that word structure. A fallacy isn't about whether the conclusion is wrong, it's about whether the reasoning that gets you there is sound. This distinction matters enormously on the exam. Here's why this matters for your score. On the multiple choice section, you'll be asked to identify what rhetorical or argumentative move an author is making, and sometimes that move is a flawed one. On the free response essays, particularly the argument essay and the rhetorical analysis, you may need to call out faulty reasoning in a source or deliberately avoid it in your own writing. Recognizing fallacies is both a reading skill and a writing skill. The fallacies you must know cold. Let's walk through the big ones with the kind of clarity that sticks. Ad hominem is Latin for against the person. And it happens when someone attacks the character of the person making the argument rather than the argument itself. If a politician says, "We can't trust my opponent's healthcare plan, after all he's been divorced twice," that's ad hominem. The divorce is irrelevant to the merits of the healthcare policy. On the AP exam, watch for language that shifts from ideas to personal traits. The trap is that sometimes character is relevant. If a financial advisor is convicted of fraud, that's germane to whether you should trust their financial advice. The edge case here is called an appeal to authority gone wrong, invoking credentials or character as the sole basis for an argument rather than addressing the substance. Straw man is one of the most common fallacies in real-world rhetoric, and the AP exam loves it. This is when someone misrepresents an opponent's position, usually by exaggerating or oversimplifying it, and then attacks that misrepresentation. Imagine someone arguing for stricter food safety regulations, and their opponent responds, "My colleague apparently wants government bureaucrats deciding every meal you eat." That's a straw man. The key signal word to watch for is apparently or so you're saying. These often introduce a distorted version of someone's actual claim. Hasty generalization happens when a conclusion is drawn from too small or unrepresentative a sample. "I met 2 rude people from that city. Everyone there must be unfriendly." You see this in anecdotal evidence all the time. On the AP exam, you might see a passage that uses a single personal story as the foundation for a sweeping policy claim. The flaw isn't that personal stories are bad evidence, they're actually powerful rhetorical tools. The flaw is treating one story as statistically representative of a whole population. False dilemma, sometimes called the either-or fallacy, presents only 2 options when in reality more exist. You're either with us or against us. Either we ban all social media or young people will continue to suffer. The real world almost always has a messy middle ground, and a speaker who pretends otherwise is manufacturing a sense of urgency that the evidence doesn't support. On FRQ scoring rubrics, pointing out false dilemma specifically requires you to explain why the missing options matter to the argument's validity, not just name the fallacy. Slippery slope assumes that one event will inevitably lead to a chain of increasingly extreme consequences without establishing that the chain is likely or necessary. If we allow students to retake this test, next they'll want to retake every assignment and soon grades will be meaningless. Each step might be possible, but the argument treats possibility as inevitability. The test for slippery slope on the exam is always the same question. Does the author provide causal evidence connecting each step, or are they just asserting the slide? Post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this, is the causation-correlation confusion you've heard about. A town installs new streetlights, and crime drops. Does that prove the streetlights caused the drop? Not necessarily. The AP exam will test your ability to distinguish between correlation and causation in argumentative passages, especially in passages that cite data. Appeal to tradition and appeal to nature are 2 fallacies that feel like common sense but aren't. Appeal to tradition argues something is good because it's always been done that way. Appeal to nature argues something is good because it's natural. Neither age nor origin is evidence of value or correctness. Common exam traps and how to avoid them. The biggest MCQ trap is confusing weak evidence with a logical fallacy. They are not the same thing. Weak evidence means the proof isn't strong enough. A logical fallacy means the reasoning structure itself is broken, regardless of the evidence's strength. If a question asks you to identify a flaw in the argument's reasoning, you're looking for structural problems, not just thin support. Another trap is treating emotional appeals as automatically fallacious. They are not. Pathos is a legitimate rhetorical strategy. The fallacy, called appeal to emotion, only occurs when emotion is used instead of logic and evidence, not alongside it. A passage that makes you feel something and also provides solid reasoning is not committing a fallacy. Connections to other units. This topic is the backbone of Units 3 and 4, where you analyze how arguments are constructed and evaluate sources. When you write your own argument in the synthesis FRQ, avoiding these fallacies is part of what earns you the highest score on the line of reasoning criterion. Faulty reasoning in your own essay can cost you a point even if your evidence is strong. Evaluating fallacies also connects directly to Unit 2's work on appeals. You need to understand what legitimate appeals look like in order to recognize when they've gone wrong. A quick mnemonic for the exam. Think of the acronym SHAFS PT, straw man, hasty generalization, ad hominem, false dilemma, post hoc, slippery slope, appeal to tradition, appeal to opposite nature. It's not pretty, but it covers your main list. As you get more confident identifying where arguments break down, you'll naturally get better at building arguments that don't. And that's exactly what we need as we move into Unit 2, where we'll study how skilled writers construct persuasive appeals that hold up under precisely this kind of scrutiny. 1.15 Counterargument and Refutation. Here's something that might surprise you. The strongest arguments aren't the ones that ignore the opposition. They're the ones that face it head-on and win anyway. Think about the last time someone actually changed your mind about something. Chances are it wasn't because they just kept repeating their own view louder and louder. It was because they acknowledged what you were thinking, took it seriously, and then showed you why their position still held up. That's exactly what counter-argument and refutation are all about, and mastering this skill is absolutely essential for your AP English language exam. What counter-argument and refutation actually mean, let's get precise with College Board terminology because the exam will test you on it. A counter-argument is an opposing claim, a perspective, objection, or alternative position that challenges the writer's main argument. A refutation, sometimes called a rebuttal, is the writer's response to that counter-argument, the move that dismantles, diminishes, or concedes it. These two elements work as a pair. You don't get credit for simply naming the opposition. The rhetorical power comes from what you do with it afterward. Think of it like a courtroom drama. A skilled defense attorney doesn't pretend the prosecution's evidence doesn't exist. Instead, they say, yes, my client was near the scene, but here's why that doesn't prove what they think it proves. That pivot is the refutation. The attorney acknowledges the threat and neutralizes it, and the jury finds the argument more credible because of that honesty, not in spite of it. The three moves of refutation. When you're analyzing how a writer handles counter-arguments on the multiple choice or free response sections, you need to recognize three distinct refutation strategies. The first is direct refutation, where the writer outright disputes the counter-argument by presenting contradictory evidence or exposing flawed reasoning. The second is concession refutation, sometimes called the yes-but move, where the writer grants partial validity to the opposing view before pivoting to show why their own claim still prevails. This is actually the most rhetorically sophisticated of the three, because it signals intellectual honesty and earns the reader's trust. The third is minimization, where the writer acknowledges the counter-argument but argues that it's simply less significant, less common, or less consequential than the opposing side suggests. Here's an everyday analogy for the concession refutation move specifically. Imagine you're trying to convince your parents to let you study abroad. They say, but it's expensive. A weak response ignores that entirely and just keeps talking about the cultural benefits. A strong response says, you're right that it costs more up front, And I've already looked into 3 scholarship programs that could cover 60% of the cost, which makes this much more feasible than it first appears. You've conceded the point has merit. You've pivoted. You've strengthened your credibility by not running away from the hard truth. Why? This matters for the AP exam on the exam. Counter-argument and refutation show up in 2 major ways. In the multiple-choice section, you'll encounter passages where the author engages with opposing viewpoints, and the questions will ask you to identify the purpose of that engagement, evaluate its effectiveness, or recognize what rhetorical strategy is being used. A common trap here is confusing a concession with a contradiction. A concession is a deliberate, strategic acknowledgement of an opposing point that the writer uses to strengthen their own credibility. A contradiction is an error in logic where the writer accidentally undermines their own argument. The College Board loves to offer answer choices that conflate these two, so watch for that distinction carefully. Another MCQ trap involves passages where the author raises a counter-argument but never actually refutes it. Students often assume that any mention of an opposing view constitutes a full counter-argument refutation pair, but that's not always the case. Sometimes a writer raises an objection only to abandon it, which can actually weaken the argument. When a question asks you to evaluate the effectiveness of the author's reasoning, consider whether the refutation is actually complete or merely gestured at. The free response connection. For the argument FRQ, the essay where you develop your own position, incorporating counter-argument and refutation, is one of the clearest ways to demonstrate what College Board calls sophistication in your reasoning. The AP scoring rubric reserves its highest marks for essays that show complexity of thought, and addressing the counter-argument is one of the most reliable paths to earning that sophistication point. But here's the critical thing: you must actually refute it. Raising a counter-argument and then dropping it, or conceding so much ground that your original thesis wobbles, will hurt your score rather than help it. A strong FRQ move looks something like this. While critics argue that social media has democratized political participation by giving ordinary citizens a platform, this view overlooks the structural inequalities in digital access that mean marginalized communities are still systematically underrepresented online. Notice what happened there. The counter-argument was stated fairly and fully, and then a specific, substantive rebuttal followed. The original argument wasn't abandoned, it was defended more convincingly because it showed awareness of the complexity. Connecting to other units. This topic connects deeply to other areas you've been studying. In Unit 1, broadly, counter-argument and refutation are inseparable from a claim and line of reasoning. A claim without awareness of its opposition is structurally weaker. In Unit 2 and beyond, when you analyze rhetorical situations and strategies in synthesis and rhetorical analysis FRQs, you'll need to explain why an author chose to engage with opposing views at a particular moment in their text. The placement of a counter-argument matters too. Addressing opposition early can preempt reader skepticism, while addressing it late can feel like the author is playing defense. Recognizing that strategic timing is a higher-level analytical skill the exam rewards. The one thing students get wrong most often, the most common mistake students make, is treating counter-argument as a courtesy, a polite nod to the other side before moving on. That fundamentally misunderstands its rhetorical function. Counter-argument and refutation are acts of persuasion, not politeness. Every time a writer engages the opposition skillfully, they are telling the reader, "I have considered the full landscape of this issue, and I still stand here." That confidence earned through genuine intellectual engagement is what moves audiences. It's what separates a strong argument from a merely loud one. With a firm grasp of how counter-argument and refutation function in both your own writing and in the texts you analyze, you're perfectly positioned to explore how evidence itself, the raw material of all these argumentative moves, gets selected, evaluated, and deployed across different rhetorical contexts. 1.16. The line of reasoning. Structuring a logical sequence of claims. Let's talk about one of the most powerful and most misunderstood concepts in AP English Language and Composition, the line of reasoning. Imagine you're trying to convince a skeptical friend to agree with you about something. You can't just say, "Trust me," and expect them to come around. You have to walk them through your thinking. step by step, building a path from your opening claim all the way to your conclusion. That path, that carefully constructed sequence of logical moves, is exactly what College Board calls your line of reasoning. And understanding it deeply is what separates a score of 3 from a score of 5 on the free response section. What is a line of reasoning? The College Board defines a line of reasoning as the logical sequence of claims and evidence that supports a writer's thesis. Think of it like constructing a staircase. Each step has to be placed deliberately at the right height in the right order, so that someone following you can ascend from the ground floor, where they might be skeptical or uninformed, all the way to your conclusion at the top. If you skip a step, your reader stumbles. If you put steps in the wrong order, the whole staircase becomes unusable. A line of reasoning is not just a list of reasons. It is an organized, progressive, logically connected sequence where each claim grows out of the one before it and paves the way for the one after. This matters enormously for the AP exam because when College Board scores your argument FRQ and your rhetorical analysis FRQ, it is specifically looking for whether you've constructed a logical progression rather than merely assembling a pile of loosely related points. The scoring rubric for the argument FRQ, for instance, awards a point in the sophistication row in part based on whether your reasoning demonstrates a complex understanding, which almost always means your line of reasoning does more than march in a straight line. It anticipates, qualifies, and builds. Claims and their relationship to the thesis. To build a solid line of reasoning, you first need to understand that your thesis is your overarching claim, the big assertion your entire argument exists to prove. Supporting claims are the intermediate steps that, together, establish the validity of that thesis. Here's a common misconception. Many students think that supporting claims are simply topics. They write a paragraph about social media, then a paragraph about education, then a paragraph about mental health, without ever making those paragraphs do argumentative work. But a supporting claim is not a topic. It is an assertion about a topic. There's a massive difference between social media as a paragraph heading and social media's algorithmic design deliberately exploits psychological vulnerability as a supporting claim. The second one is arguable, specific, and advances your thinking. On the AP exam, when you read a text for rhetorical analysis, College Board wants you to identify how an author sequences their supporting claims. Ask yourself, does each claim build on the previous one? Or could you scramble the paragraphs and lose nothing? Sophisticated authors arrange their reasoning so that the order itself is argumentative. They might move from establishing a problem to analyzing its causes to proposing a solution, each step depending on the last. Logical connectives and transitions as evidence of structure. One of the clearest signals of a line of reasoning in any text, and in your own writing, is the use of logical connectives, words and phrases like therefore, because this suggests, consequently, however, while it might seem, and building on this are the mortar between the bricks of your argument. When you see these in a passage on the multiple choice section, pay attention. College Board will frequently ask you why an author uses a particular transitional phrase, and the answer is almost always tied to the logical relationship between adjacent claims. A phrase like, and yet signals a concession and complication, therefore signals deductive consequence, for example, signals evidentiary support. If you can name the logical relationship, you can answer the question. Here's a trap that appears often on the multiple choice section. An answer choice will describe a paragraph's purpose in terms of its content rather than its logical function. You might see a choice that says this paragraph describes the conditions of urban poverty, alongside a choice that says this paragraph establishes the premise upon which the author's central argument depends. On the AP exam, the second type of answer, the one that names the logical function, is almost always the stronger choice. Train yourself to see structure, not just content. The difference between line of reasoning and evidence. Students frequently confuse the line of reasoning with evidence, and this confusion will cost you points. Evidence is what you use to support a claim. The data, anecdote, quote, statistic, or example. The line of reasoning is the argumentative framework into which that evidence is placed. Think of it this way. Evidence is the furniture in a house, and the line of reasoning is the architecture. You can have beautiful furniture, but if there are no rooms, no structural walls guiding you from the front door to the kitchen to the bedroom, the furniture is just scattered junk. College Board explicitly calls out this distinction in the rubric by separating the evidence row from the commentary and sophistication rows. Evidence earns points by being specific and relevant. Line of reasoning earns points by being coherent and logically progressive. Connections to other units. This concept threads through the entire course. In Unit 2, when you study how authors develop arguments, you're essentially analyzing how their line of reasoning unfolds. In Units 4 and 5, when you examine rhetorical situations and claims, you're building the foundational vocabulary that makes line of reasoning analysis possible. And in the synthesis FRQ, which you'll encounter at the end of the year, constructing a strong line of reasoning is precisely what allows you to blend multiple sources into a single, coherent argument, rather than producing what readers call a source dump, where you quote sources but never connect them to a logical progression. For the argument FRQ specifically, remember this: College Board doesn't just want you to support your thesis. It wants your argument to develop. Each body paragraph should be doing new work, advancing the reasoning, not just adding another example. If your second paragraph could be deleted without weakening the logic connecting your first paragraph to your conclusion, you haven't built a line of reasoning. You've built a list. A practical visualization: when you draft your argument, try sketching it as a flowchart. Put your thesis at the top, draw an arrow down to your first supporting claim and ask, does this claim directly serve the thesis? Then draw an arrow to your second claim and ask, does this claim require the first claim to make full sense, or is it completely independent? If it's completely independent, that's a red flag. Your claims are parallel illustrations rather than a progressive sequence. The strongest arguments have a logical dependency running through them, where each step genuinely enables the next. With this foundation in place, you're now ready to look at how writers use specific types of evidence, from personal anecdote to statistical data, to actually fill in the steps of that logical staircase, which is exactly where we're heading next. 1.17 Complexity in Argumentation, Acknowledging Nuance, Tensions, and Limitations. Here's something most students don't realize until it's almost too late. The AP exam doesn't reward the student who sounds the most confident. It rewards the student who sounds the most sophisticated. And sophistication, in the world of argument, means acknowledging that reality is messy. That's exactly what this section is about. What complexity in argumentation actually means. Imagine you're arguing with a brilliant friend about whether social media is good for society. If you just say it's terrible and here's why, your friend will immediately fire back with counterexamples you hadn't considered. But if you say, look, there are real documented harms, loneliness, misinformation, mental health effects on teenagers, and yet it has also connected isolated communities and democratized access to information, which makes this genuinely complicated. Suddenly your friend leans forward. That's complexity in argumentation. The College Board's specific term for this is acknowledging nuance, and it refers to a writer's willingness to recognize that their own argument has limits, that competing perspectives contain legitimate points, and that the relationship between evidence and claim is sometimes more complicated than a simple cause and effect chain. On the AP exam, this concept appears in both the multiple choice and the free response sections, and it is one of the most reliable separators between a score of 3 and a score of 5. The 3 core components you must know. The College Board framework organizes complexity around 3 interconnected moves, and you need to be able to name them, recognize them in a passage, and deploy them yourself. The first is acknowledging counterclaims and limitations. A sophisticated writer doesn't pretend opposing evidence doesn't exist. They bring it into the room on their own terms and show they can handle it. This is different from simply mentioning a counter-argument and dismissing it with, but some people disagree, you must genuinely engage. A strong writer might say something like, critics of standardized testing have a point when they argue that such exams disadvantage students from under-resourced schools. This concern deserves serious weight. The key phrase there is deserves serious weight. That's intellectual honesty, not weakness. The second component is identifying tensions and contradictions within the argument itself or within the evidence. Think of attention as two things that are both true but pull against each other. A doctor might argue that opioid medications save lives for chronic pain patients, and it's also true that the same medications have fueled an addiction crisis. Both claims are supported by strong evidence. The tension between them is real, and a sophisticated arguer names it rather than pretending it doesn't exist. When you see a passage on the MCQ section that seems to undercut itself, don't immediately assume the writer made an error. Ask yourself, is this writer intentionally surfacing attention? The third component is qualifying claims. This means using precise language to narrow the scope of what you're claiming so that you only assert what your evidence can actually support. Words like often, in many cases, under certain conditions, and for this particular population are not signs of a weak argument. They are signs of an honest one. The opposite of qualification is overstatement, and overstatement is one of the most penalized moves on the AP exam rubric. If your evidence shows that exercise tends to improve mood in most adults, your claim should reflect that precision, not leap to exercise cures depression. How this appears on the MCQ section: multiple choice questions on complexity tend to take a few predictable forms, and knowing these in advance is like knowing the trapdoor before it opens beneath you. The most common trap is the false binary answer choice. You'll be asked something like, the author's primary purpose in paragraph 4 is to, and two of the answer choices will represent extreme positions. One that says the author is simply conceding defeat, and another that says the author is sarcastically dismissing the counter-argument. The correct answer almost always describes a middle ground move, something like to acknowledge the validity of an opposing perspective while maintaining the central claim. Train yourself to look for that kind of answer. Another MCQ trap involves the word undermines. A question might ask which sentence most undermines the author's argument, and students often choose the sentence that sounds negative or critical. But a sentence can appear to weaken an argument while actually strengthening it through qualified concession. If the author says, while these programs are not perfect solutions, they represent the most evidence-based approach currently available, that sentence isn't undermining the argument, it's reinforcing the author's credibility by being honest about limitations. What the FRQ scoring rubric demands on the free response questions, particularly the synthesis and argument essays, the complexity row of the rubric is where students most often leave points on the table. The College Board is explicit. To earn the complexity point, you must do more than acknowledge that some people disagree. You must demonstrate a qualitatively different level of understanding about the issue. That means one of the following moves: explaining the significance of an alternative perspective rather than just naming it, identifying a limitation in your own evidence and explaining why you're still justified in your claim, showing how two pieces of evidence exist in productive tension, or extending your argument to consider its implications in a broader or different context. Think of it this way: the complexity point is not a checkbox for mentioning a counterargument. It's a reward for genuinely wrestling with the difficulty of your own position, and then standing in that difficulty rather than rushing to resolve it too neatly. Connecting to the larger course. This concept doesn't exist in isolation. Complexity in argumentation ties directly to your understanding of rhetorical appeals from earlier in the unit. Because ethos, your credibility as a writer, is built substantially on whether your audience trusts you to be honest about what you don't know and what your argument can't fully explain. It also connects to evidence evaluation in Unit 1, because recognizing limitations often means recognizing what a piece of evidence fails to prove, not just what it does prove. And when you reach the synthesis essay in your FRQ work, every source you incorporate will have a potential tension with at least one other source. Your job is to navigate those tensions rather than paper over them. The student who writes "this is complicated and here's exactly why it's complicated" is writing the essay that scores a 5. Complexity isn't a disclaimer, it's a demonstration of intellectual power. Coming up next, we'll look at how writers use line of reasoning to hold all of these complex, qualified, tension-aware claims together into a coherent whole, because acknowledging nuance is only half the battle. Organizing it is the other half. 1.18 Concession versus Refutation. Distinguishing between partial agreement and direct rebuttal. Let's talk about one of the most elegant moves a writer can make, and one of the most frequently confused pairs of concepts on the AP Lang exam. Picture this. You're in a debate, and someone on the other side makes a point you actually think is pretty reasonable. What do? Do you pretend you didn't hear it? Do you steamroll over it? Or do you acknowledge it thoughtfully and then pivot? The way a skilled writer handles opposing viewpoints is the difference between an argument that sounds brittle and defensive and one that sounds confident, nuanced, and intellectually mature. That's exactly what this section is about. Defining concession and refutation. Let's start with clean AP precise definitions, because the College Board will absolutely test whether you can tell these apart. A concession is when a writer partially agrees with an opposing viewpoint. The writer acknowledges that the counterargument has some merit, some truth, or some validity, but crucially, the concession does not abandon the writer's central claim. Think of it as a chess player saying, "Yes, your move was smart, but watch what I do next." The concession admits a point without surrendering the argument. Signal phrases that flag a concession include, "It is true that," admittedly, granted, of course, while it may be the case that, and certainly, when you hear or read those phrases, your brain should immediately think, partial agreement incoming. A refutation, by contrast, is when a writer directly challenges and undermines a counter-argument. Rather than granting it any validity, the writer argues that the opposing point is flawed, factually wrong, logically inconsistent, or irrelevant. Refutation says, in effect, "Your move wasn't smart at all, and here's why." Signal phrases for refutation include, "However, in fact, on the contrary, this claim ignores, the evidence suggests otherwise, and this reasoning is flawed because where a concession softens, a refutation pushes back hard." Why this distinction matters. Here's a useful analogy. Imagine you're a lawyer in a closing argument. One approach is to pretend the opposing counsel said nothing worth mentioning, but jurors aren't fooled and they wonder why you're avoiding the tough questions. A smarter approach is to look the jury in the eye and say, "The defense makes a fair point about the timeline. But that point, even if true, doesn't explain the fingerprints." That's a concession then rebuttal move, and it's devastatingly effective. The other approach, the defense's timeline argument is entirely fabricated and unsupported by any witness testimony, is a refutation. Both are legitimate, but they accomplish different rhetorical things, and skilled writers choose between them deliberately. On the AP exam, you'll be asked to identify which move an author is making, explain why they chose it, and in the synthesis and argument-free response questions, you'll be expected to deploy both moves yourself. The concession refutation structure, many sophisticated arguments use a two-step move that combines both. The writer concedes something real, then immediately pivots to refute the larger claim that concession might seem to support. You'll see this construction constantly in op-eds, academic essays, and political speeches. The structure looks like this. Granted, opposing point has some truth, but here is why it doesn't defeat my argument. Here is the more important consideration. Think of Michelle Obama's "when they go low, we go high" as a kind of rhetorical model here. You acknowledge the attack, concession to its existence, but you redirect the argument onto higher, more favorable terrain. The concession builds credibility. The refutation restores momentum. Common MCQ traps and how to avoid them. Here's where students lose points, and I want you to be bulletproof against these traps. The most common MCQ mistake is confusing a concession with a full agreement. Remember, a concession never surrenders the writer's core claim. If the passage shows the writer changing their position entirely based on an opposing view, that is something different. That's actually a qualification or a reversal, not a concession. Watch for this bait and switch. A second common trap involves mistaking an acknowledgement of complexity for a concession. Sometimes writers say this issue is complicated or the data is mixed. That's hedging or qualification, not necessarily a concession to a specific opposing argument. The College Board tests whether you can identify the precise rhetorical move, not just a vague sense that the writer is being careful. A third trap, students often identify refutation as the author is being aggressive or dismissive. Refutation doesn't require hostility. You can refute an argument calmly and logically. This claim, while popular, lacks empirical support, and that is still a refutation. Tone and rhetorical function are separate things. Connecting to the rest of AP Lang. This topic connects directly to several other areas of the course you need to hold together. In Unit 1, you've been building an understanding of how claims, evidence, and reasoning work together. Concession and refutation are tools for managing the relationship between your argument and competing arguments. They are, at their core, methods of acknowledging that the world is complicated while still advancing a position. In Unit 3, when you analyze how an author builds an argument, you'll frequently need to describe these moves at the structural level. How does the writer organize their response to counter-arguments? Where in the essay does the concession appear, and what does its placement suggest about rhetorical strategy? A concession near the beginning often functions as a trust-building move. A concession near the end can feel like damage control. In the FRQ argument essay specifically, AP readers are trained to award points for nuance and complexity, and the single most reliable way to demonstrate nuance is to address a counter-argument with either a concession, a refutation, or ideally the combined move. A response that ignores opposing viewpoints entirely is capped at a certain complexity level, no matter how polished the prose. When you're writing under timed conditions, plan at least one moment where you acknowledge what reasonable people on the other side might say, and then show why your argument still holds. The takeaway to lock in concession equals partial agreement, grants merit to the opposition without abandoning your claim. Refutation equals direct challenge, argues the opposing point is wrong or insufficient. The combined concession-refutation move is the gold standard of sophisticated argumentation. It builds credibility and then reasserts the argument from a stronger position. And when you're identifying these moves in an author's text, ask yourself, is the author granting ground or taking it back? With that framework firmly in hand, let's move forward into how writers use these and other rhetorical strategies to develop the overall structure and complexity of their arguments. 1.19 Source credibility and evaluating bias in evidence. Why this skill is the foundation of everything. Imagine you're sitting at a coffee shop, and two strangers walk up to your table trying to convince you of something. The first one says, "I read somewhere that coffee is actually terrible for you." The second one says, "I'm a cardiologist, and I've reviewed 15 peer-reviewed longitudinal studies on caffeine and cardiovascular health." You'd listen very differently to each of them, right? That instinct, that gut-level evaluation of who is speaking, why they might be speaking, and what they're basing their claims on is exactly what AP English Language is training you to do with precision and analytical vocabulary. Source credibility and bias evaluation aren't just academic exercises. They're the lens through which every skilled reader and writer sees the world. What College Board means by source credibility. When the College Board talks about source credibility, they're asking you to assess whether a piece of evidence is trustworthy and relevant for the argument being made. The key word there is relevant. A source can be credible in its own field and still be wrong for a particular argument. A sports commentator may be credible talking about basketball strategy, but if someone uses that same commentator as a source in an argument about neuroscience, the credibility doesn't transfer. For the exam, you need to evaluate credibility through several lenses. First, consider the author's expertise and authority. Do they have training, experience, or a demonstrated track record in the specific area they're discussing? Second, think about the publication or platform. Peer-reviewed academic journals carry more weight than anonymous blog posts, and primary sources generally outrank secondary ones. Third, examine the currency of the source. In fast-moving fields like medicine or technology, a study from 1987 may be outdated regardless of how rigorous it was. Finally, think about purpose and audience. A source written to inform a specialist audience using field-specific methodology is usually more credible than one written to entertain a general audience, even if both are factually accurate. Understanding bias and why all sources have it, here's something that trips students up constantly on the exam. Bias does not automatically mean a source is wrong or useless. Bias means a source has a particular perspective, interest, or inclination that shapes how it presents information. Think about it this way. A study funded by a tobacco company in 1955 showing that cigarettes were harmless had a significant conflict of interest, a financial reason to skew its conclusion. That's bias with very high stakes. But a scientist who has spent 30 years studying climate change also has a perspective, and that perspective is shaped by deep expertise. College Board wants you to distinguish between bias that undermines credibility and perspective that is simply inherent to human knowledge-making. On the multiple-choice section, you'll frequently encounter passages where a piece of evidence is presented, and the question asks you to evaluate its reliability or identify a potential weakness. The classic trap here is to dismiss evidence simply because the source has an opinion or a stake in the outcome. That's too blunt an instrument. Instead, ask yourself, does this bias make the evidence less reliable, and if so, in what specific way? A pharmaceutical company's internal study might still contain valid data, but you'd want corroboration from an independent source. The CRAP test and its AP equivalent. You may have encountered the CRAP test in a research class: currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, purpose. College Board doesn't use that acronym on the exam, but the underlying logic is deeply compatible with what they're testing. When you see a passage excerpt followed by questions about the evidence's effectiveness or limitations, you're essentially running a fast version of that checklist. The exam will never ask you to name the CREP test, but it absolutely tests whether you can apply its principles under pressure. A particularly important concept here is the distinction between primary and secondary sources. Primary sources are original: a scientific study, a speech, a first-hand account, a photograph, a dataset. Secondary sources interpret or analyze primary ones: a newspaper article summarizing a study, a biography, a review essay. On the AP exam, an argument that relies heavily on secondary sources when primary sources were available is considered weaker, because each layer of interpretation introduces additional opportunity for distortion. Evaluating bias in evidence you're reading versus evidence you're using. Here's a nuance that separates a score of 3 from a score of 5. The exam tests your ability to think about source evaluation from 2 directions simultaneously. In the multiple-choice section, you're analyzing how a writer in a given passage uses or misuses evidence. You're the outside evaluator. In the synthesis essay, FRQ question 1, you're the writer, and you must demonstrate that you can select, evaluate, and attribute sources responsibly yourself. When you're writing the synthesis essay, College Board rewards students who don't just cite sources but actually engage with their credibility. This means you might write something like, according to a 2021 report from the National Institutes of Health, a government body with established scientific authority. That attribution isn't just a formality, it's a rhetorical move that strengthens your argument by signaling that you understand why the evidence counts. Conversely, burying a source's potential bias without acknowledging it, especially when it's obvious, can actually weaken your score because evaluators see that you're not thinking critically about what you're using. Common exam traps to watch for. The most dangerous trap in multiple-choice questions about credibility is conflating expertise with objectivity. An expert can still be biased. Expertise and objectivity are separate variables. Similarly, watch out for questions that ask whether anecdotal evidence is ever valid. The correct answer is usually nuanced. Anecdotes can be rhetorically powerful and even appropriate in certain contexts, but they cannot substitute for systematic evidence when statistical claims are being made. Also, be cautious about questions involving statistics. A correctly cited statistic from a credible organization can still be misleading if it's taken out of context or if the sample size is insufficient. The source's credibility doesn't automatically validate the argument built on it. Connections to other units. This skill runs through every single unit of this course like a thread. In Unit 2, when you analyze how writers develop arguments, you're always evaluating whether their evidence is well-sourced. In Units 4 and 5, when you examine rhetoric and style, understanding a writer's position and potential bias helps you decode why they're making particular rhetorical choices. And in Unit 8, when you write your own arguments, everything you've learned about credibility becomes a tool you wield. You're not just a critic anymore, you're a practitioner. The ability to evaluate sources critically is ultimately what separates someone who merely reads from someone who truly thinks. and that distinction is exactly what the AP exam is designed to reward. Next, we'll build on this foundation by exploring how writers themselves construct arguments, looking closely at how claims and reasoning work together to create the kind of intellectual architecture that holds an essay firmly in place. 120. Integrating evidence. Introducing, quoting, paraphrasing, and citing sources. Why evidence integration is the engine of AP writing. Imagine you're making a case to a friend that a particular movie is secretly brilliant. You wouldn't just say, "Trust me, it's great." You'd pull up a specific scene, describe what the director did, explain why it matters, and connect it back to your point. That, in a nutshell, is what evidence integration is. It's not just dropping proof into your essay and hoping the reader figures it out. It's the art of weaving outside material into your own argument so seamlessly that the evidence feels inevitable, like it belongs exactly where you put it on the AP language exam. Evidence integration isn't a soft skill, it's a scored one. The free response question rubrics, particularly for the synthesis and argument essays, explicitly reward students who demonstrate sophisticated use of sources. Tossing in a quote without context will cost you points. Learning to introduce, quote, paraphrase, and cite with precision is how you move from a 3 to a 5. The 3 moves: introducing, using, and explaining. The College Board expects you to understand evidence integration as a 3-part choreography. Think of it like a relay race. The introduction hands the baton to the evidence, and the evidence hands it to your analysis. Drop the baton at any stage, and the momentum collapses. First is the introduction, sometimes called a signal phrase or attributive tag. This is the sentence or clause that contextualizes your evidence before it arrives. A signal phrase does several things simultaneously. It tells the reader who said something, establishes that source's credibility, and previews the rhetorical purpose of what's coming. Compare, according to environmental scientist Jane Lubchenco, with just launching into a, quote, cold. The first version anchors the reader, the second leaves them scrambling. On the AP exam, strong signal phrases often incorporate the author's name alongside a verb that characterizes their rhetorical stance. Words like argues, contends, acknowledges, insists, or challenges. Notice how each of those verbs carries a different shade of meaning. To argue is active and assertive. To acknowledge suggests the source is conceding something. Choosing the right verb is a signal of your own analytical sophistication, and readers of AP essays notice this. Second comes the evidence itself, which arrives in one of 2 forms: direct quotation or paraphrase. A direct quotation uses the source's exact words enclosed in quotation marks. A paraphrase restates the source's idea in your own language and sentence structure, not just swapping synonyms, but genuinely reconstructing the idea. Students frequently confuse paraphrase with summary. Summary compresses a larger section of text into a shorter overview, while paraphrase translates a specific passage into your own voice at roughly similar length. The AP exam will test your understanding of this distinction, particularly in the multiple-choice section where you may be asked to identify whether a passage is paraphrasing, summarizing, or directly quoting a source. Knowing when to quote versus when to paraphrase is itself a rhetorical decision. Quote directly when the original wording is distinctive, when the author's specific language is the point, or when you plan to analyze the style of the language itself. Paraphrase when you need to fold information into your essay's flow, when the original phrasing is awkward or technical, or when you want to demonstrate that you genuinely understand the material rather than just lifting words. Overquoting is one of the most common pitfalls AP graders see. An essay that's 40% block quotes is not a well-supported argument, it's a scrapbook. The explanation where the points are won. Here is the most critical concept in this entire section, and it's the one students most often skip. After your evidence, you must explain it. Not summarize it, explain it. Tell the reader what the evidence means, why it supports your claim, and how it connects to your argument's larger purpose. This is sometimes called the so what move, and it is where AP rubric points live. Think of evidence as a witness in a courtroom. The witness doesn't get to deliver the verdict, the lawyer does. You are the lawyer. When you drop in a quote and then immediately move to your next point, you've left the witness on the stand without cross-examination. The grader is left wondering whether you actually understood what you cited. The explanation doesn't have to be long, but it has to be there and it has to be substantive. Phrases like "this shows that" or "this demonstrates" are weak openers for your explanation. Push further into "this reveals," "this implies," or "this challenges the assumption that," which force you into genuine analysis. Citation and academic integrity. The AP language exam, particularly the synthesis essay, provides you with sources and expects you to reference them clearly. The standard College Board format is simply to cite the source by letter in parentheses, for example, source C, immediately after you've used material from that source. This signals to the reader and the grader that you are drawing on the provided materials intentionally. You don't need MLA or APA formatting on the AP exam itself, but you do need to demonstrate that you can attribute ideas to their origins. Failing to cite a source you've clearly used or misattributing evidence to the wrong source will undermine your score on both the evidence and sophistication dimensions of the rubric. Common traps in exam edge cases. The most dangerous wrong answer trap on multiple choice questions about evidence integration involves the difference between what a source says and what the author implies by choosing to include it. A question might ask whether a paraphrase accurately represents a source's claim, and the trap answer will be a paraphrase that's technically close to the original, but subtly shifts the author's tone or certainty. Read those options slowly and watch for hedging language being removed or added. Another common FRQ scoring miss is what graders call evidence without commentary. You can earn a point for incorporating evidence correctly, but you cannot earn the analysis point without the explanation that follows it. The rubric treats these as separate achievements. Students who rush through their body paragraphs often earn one of those 2 points, not both. Finally, notice how this skill threads through every unit of AP Lang. When you study rhetorical analysis in Unit 2, you'll be analyzing how other writers integrate evidence. When you write your argument essay in Unit 3, you'll be doing exactly what this section describes. Evidence integration isn't a standalone topic. It's the connective tissue of academic writing itself. Now that you understand how to bring evidence into your argument, let's turn to how writers organize and structure those arguments across an entire essay, because getting the pieces right means nothing if the architecture of the whole doesn't hold together.